a boy who lived his entire life in misery trained to become a warrior and participate in battles to protect his kingdom. Along the way, he faced difficulties but never gave up on achieving his goals, pushing through to the very end. However, what this warrior did not expect was that the battles would grow increasingly intense, forcing him to face unimaginable enemies alongside other formidable warriors. This made our hero long for a chance to go back in time and try different approaches, though he never imagined his wish could come true. The story begins with a glimpse of a world that is doomed. Companions who went through hell and came back. The 10 strongest knights who guard the continent. They exhausted all their life force and mana, and above the vast stretches of contaminated land, only death remained. All these horrible events were caused by a single entity, a demonic and relentless creature, one who felt no remorse for its actions. It was called the Demon Commander of Gluttony. The monster stares at the protagonist, confirming his name is Tiny, and admits that he is strong. However, it states that the protagonist should know his strength is far from sufficient to take its life in battle. After saying this, Tiny charges forward. Using a hammer as a weapon, he unleashes a thunderous strike. The creature withstands the blow and tells the protagonist to give up, claiming his efforts are futile. But Tiny simply yells at the monster to shut up. Meanwhile, he continues attacking, this time using the meteor summon. After striking the monster, Tiny calls it a noisy bastard. He does not stop attacking, using all his strength against this enemy. After a while, he finally gains some peace, having defeated the creature. But he believes he will die alongside the enemy, because even though he won, he was severely wounded. Not only that, but his mana was also completely depleted. He reflects that everything was wrong from the start, and recalls that mana training was knowledge exclusive to distinguished knights and the nobility. For this reason, he had to overcome countless setbacks, advancing slower than everyone else, climbing to the top of the knights from the very bottom. Tiny always believed he could overcome these challenges, but now he wonders if that was truly the case, thinking that if only he had trained with the proper methods from the beginning, he could have saved the continent and everyone in it. Now all his mana is gone, used up to defeat the Demon Commander of Gluttony, a tremendously powerful foe. However, this was only the 7th of all the commanders, prompting the protagonist to wonder just how strong the other commanders and the Demon King are. Amidst these thoughts, someone calls out to him on the battlefield, asking if Tiny is still alive. It is the Sword Emperor Asgard von Valencia. He says that, unfortunately, he will be dead soon. But before he goes, he would like to ask the protagonist one question. He asks why Tiny didn't flee this battle. Tiny hesitates, but the Emperor says he once heard that the protagonist was a child from the slums and asks if there is nothing he wishes to protect. He also says things must have been very difficult for Tiny. The protagonist says he was curious about what the Emperor wanted to ask, and says it is shameful. He also admits he hates being more inadequate than most, stating that a man must remain confident anywhere, and for that reason, he declares he would never flee from a fight. Upon hearing this answer, the Emperor immediately begins to laugh. Tiny remarks that he seems to have quite a bit of strength since he is laughing. The Emperor says it will work out, and Tiny should trust in the talent that made him one of the 10 strongest knights with only his pride. He also says that if Tiny returns, he should find him. The protagonist once again does not understand, but the Emperor says that if Tiny recklessly visits him in the past, his younger self probably won't believe this story, so he reveals a secret to Tiny, saying his daughter's birth name was Lila. It came from the name of the flower he and his wife liked. However, he confesses that he never truly liked that flower, claiming this is the most important part, and Tiny must not forget it. He also urges the protagonist to find him as quickly as possible. Tiny has no idea what is happening, but he notices his consciousness fading and assumes he is dying. However, he suddenly wakes up and sees that the room around him looks familiar, making him wonder if he is dead or dreaming. However, he cannot believe he is going through all this again. This is because this is a past where his sister's body was taken right after she passed away. After his sister was gone, they came in. Tiny gets irritated whenever he thinks about Irina, who hid the gold ring. But he quickly remembers that it was actually him who hid it, and his sister was beaten while trying to protect him. He recalls some guys showing up, saying they almost messed up Wolf because of her, and they wanted to teach her a lesson so she would never do it again. At that time, the guys showed up and beat her up. The protagonist thinks he barely survived with his fragile body, and his sister died while taking care of him, even though she was injured. However, what he thought was a distant memory resurfaces in his mind. The men show up and, with just one kick, knock Tiny's sister down, boasting about it. Even knowing she was dead, they didn't stop. And, as if that weren't enough, they even tried to take her body. One of them hesitates to do it, but the other says there are some sick guys who like dead bodies, and fresh organs can fetch some money. Still a child, Tiny tried to stop them, but he thinks he cannot protect her, even in his dreams. Lying in his bed, he tries with all his strength to move. Suddenly, his arm starts to move, along with an energy that arose in his body. With that, he got what he wanted and advanced toward the bad guys. Shortly after, the protagonist managed to strike one of them, in such a way that the man felt the impact, and he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Then, he gets up with his companion, saying that this boy must have a death wish. The two gang up to beat the protagonist, saying he wasn't allowed to leave his bed. Young Tiny resisted because he only wanted to protect his sister. After beating him up severely, the men give up on taking the body due to the boy's persistence, and ironically, they tell him to have fun with his dead sister. But now the protagonist realizes this is different from his past, because the ending of the nightmares he has had until now has changed. He is unsure why the sudden change, still believing he is in a dream. He also remembers that he couldn't manipulate mana at this age. Then, he recalls the Emperor's last words, and starts to believe that he really was sent back to the past. Tiny begins to realize he is not in a dream, because now he imagines he can change his future. Tiny doesn't believe he can manipulate mana at this age, but he starts to believe it when he sees his powers in action. Soon, he concludes that the Emperor indeed sent him to the past, and he realizes this is truly not a dream. Then, he says the old man made a mistake in sending him now because he wished to be a bit further ahead, precisely because, at this time in his life, his body is still fragile. The protagonist is aware that he is just venting uselessly, and the Sword Emperor was not confident in his own power. But he thinks he can see this as a chance to let his sister rest in peace, since he couldn't even do that in his past life. Tiny then remembers that the Emperor told him to meet him as soon as possible. However, he thinks that will have to wait a bit. After finishing what he must do, he will soon make his way. Now the protagonist desires revenge against the one who killed his sister, known as Wolf, because in his past life, he almost killed him by breaking his spine. But this time, he wants a more fitting revenge. However, before that, he wishes to take his sister to a place of rest. Sometime later, he manages to take her to a cemetery, and he thinks that he wasn't connected to Irina by blood. All they had in common were their black eyes and hair, a rare sight on the continent. Many people among the invaders avoided or harmed him because of this. But his sister used to say he reminded her of her lost brother, so she named him Tiny and treated him with genuine love and care. Sending his sister to rest without being able to repay all she did for him leaves the protagonist somewhat frustrated. Regardless, a priest performs the normal funeral rites. Among the people present, a girl looks at the protagonist and wonders if Irina died because of him. Her name is Emma, Irina's friend, and she thinks Tiny seems to have changed a little. Even some time ago, she found them at their house and saw the child eating right in front of his sister's body. But upon looking closely, he notices that the boy's wounds healed instantly. After that, the protagonist picked up Irina's body. Emma asked where he thought he was going with those injuries. Even though the protagonist insisted he was fine, the girl persisted that he should take care of himself. She also said she didn't understand why he listened to Irina's words but not hers. However, surprisingly, the protagonist thanked her for the food, and also for taking care of him, affirming that he would make sure to return the favor. Emma definitely wasn't expecting that, but suddenly, they were holding a funeral afterward, and she wondered what was going through the boy's mind. Speaking of him, Tiny thought this was the only way to make peace with Emma. He also thought he shouldn't blame himself and feel discouraged because that wasn't what his sister would have wanted. She always told Tiny to be confident and keep his head held high. Soon, the protagonist declared that he held on to Irina's words, saying she should watch him from above and asserting that he wouldn't have any regrets this time. A month after the funeral, the protagonist was ready to start over. He then walked to a specific place. Some men recognized him as one of the slum kids, thinking they could take his money all at once. But as they approached, Tiny asked where Wolf was. One of the men, irritated, asked how he dared to say that name, claiming he must have lost his mind. He even tried to slap the boy but was stopped. Tiny sarcastically asked what was wrong with mentioning Wolf's name. Meanwhile, he gripped the man's arm tightly, making him scream in pain. Seeing his partner fall to the ground, another man asked what was wrong with this kid, thinking Tiny must have found a potion or something to have gotten so strong. But he believed Tiny was just another brat, and went for an attack, grabbing the boy by the shirt. The man tried to lift him but struggled greatly, wondering why the boy was so heavy. Tiny said the man must be wondering what was going on since he was heavier than he looked, and told the man to just give up, but then added that the man wouldn't be able to do that anyway and kicked him hard. His mana body had replaced his previous weakness. He hadn't been able to do this in his past life, but now it was different, because he had perfectly fused a copy of his mana body with his physical body, one that could become more powerful as a result of the interactions between the two bodies. This was the core of the secret technique Tiny had developed. This technique was powerful, but it required him to eat much more than normal to be effective, which was why he had consumed 10 days worth of food from Emma's house. In any case, it gave him the strength he needed. The protagonist said that in addition to realizing something after remaking his mana body, a single mana awakening had an easier time finding its place in damaged bodies. The fallen man didn't understand what he was saying. Tiny explained that it meant he was thankful that the man had once broken his body. After saying this, he hurled the man as if he were nothing. The man's body smashed through a door and passed by several others. Inside, they were alarmed by the presence of an intruder and wondered who he was. Seeing Tiny enter, they identified him as the slum brat. From above, some noticed that the boy had come there alone and questioned what he would do without a weapon. The protagonist asked what they meant by without a weapon. Then, with his bare hands, he attacked, saying he did have a weapon, his own body, which he used to defeat his enemies and throw them as if their weight were as light as paper. The mess the protagonist made was enormous. He fought against multiple grown men with a child's body, making it seem insignificant, because no one there was a match for him. Tiny even had fun beating his targets. When he finished, everyone was on the ground, and some had even lost a few teeth. Thus, the first stage was complete. He declared he was tired of dealing with the small fry. What remained were the Reincarnated brothers, and Tiny asked why they wouldn't come down to fight him. After the protagonist confronted the brothers, one of them declared he would split Tiny in two, but as they faced the boy, another brother noted that Tiny was a mana user. Soon, they conclude that the body of a mana user can be sold for a good price. While Tiny was playing with one of the fallen bodies, the two brothers tried to catch him off guard, and then he tossed the body aside, saying it was already all broken. A flashback from his past life shows a moment when he was using a person as a weapon. One of his superiors called him crazy and asked him to show some class, but Tiny asked how he could possibly do that. Then the superior said that instead of using a cheap trick like that, he could learn hand-to-hand combat. Back in the present moment, the protagonist thinks that with this, he should be able to maintain his dignity. So, he waits for the brothers to approach, and immediately after he dodges their sword strikes. After that, he steps back a little, making one of the enemies realize that Tiny was able to predict their movements. In turn, Tiny takes the opportunity to land a solid punch on the enemy's face. This amazes his brother, but soon after, he was the next one to fall. Their fight didn't last long, as the protagonist easily defeated them both and went straight to Wolf's room. The leader of the invaders asks who the boy is. In his past life, the protagonist did something similar. At the time, he was older, and when he encountered Wolf, who was a pimp in a remote area, he belonged to the Beastman tribe, considered the best among the demi-human races. Among them, the pure silver werewolf was special, since he had a trait usually found only in the direct bloodlines of the Beastman royal family. It was very difficult to kill him in Tiny's past life, as he didn't know why a silver wolf was in such a place. But this time, he knows what awaits him. Seeing the boy, Wolf asks if he was the one who caused all this mess. Tiny asks if he can't deduce the answer himself, saying his intelligence must only go that far. Wolf calls him an insolent brat, and promises to tear out his tongue. Soon, he begins transforming into his beastly form, and the protagonist says it would have been better if he attacked with everything from the start. Wolf's claws begin to emerge, along with hairy animalistic paws. This way, Wolf transforms completely, but Tiny becomes a little confused, saying that Wolf doesn't have gray fur, as he imagined, and asking what kind of dog he turned into. Wolf doesn't like being called that, and launches into a furious attack. The protagonist wonders what is going on, as he notices that Wolf is stronger and faster than the Reincarnated brothers. Still, he dodges the attacks, and thinks that Wolf cannot be compared to how he was in his past life. Then, he decides to end this and clamps the wolf's mouth shut, asking if the enemy thinks he came back just to see these weak attacks. With that, Wolf is left in shock. Not only that, but he starts bleeding due to the strength the protagonist applied. Tiny has an advantage, as he once heard from a Beastman companion how to handle their kin in berserker mode. Then Wolf becomes even more furious. However, the protagonist manages to dodge all his strikes. He thinks this is why the Beastman companion said that beating is the best treatment for a rabid dog, which is exactly what Tiny does, but he tells Wolf not to die yet, as he wants to beat him to death. The Beastman companion used to say it's fine to hit them a little since they have excellent regenerative abilities. Knowing this, the protagonist doesn't hold back his strength, and takes the opportunity to beat the enemy severely. But as he comes across a wall, a crack reveals a magical seal. Immediately, Wolf returns to his normal state. Tiny then asks if he has come to his senses. Scared, Wolf asks why the boy is doing this to him, but the protagonist simply tells him to shut up, saying this won't end with just his spine this time. He also tells him to beg for forgiveness for what he did to his sister. After feeling satisfied, Tiny says to his sister that he hopes he gave her some comfort for her pain. He tells Wolf that if it were up to him, he'd cut his head off. Wolf begs for forgiveness, just as the boy told him to do, saying he deeply regrets what he did. But the protagonist's rage is so intense that he wants to decapitate him and take his head as an offering to his sister's grave. Hearing this makes Wolf even more desperate. Then Tiny says that his sister probably wouldn't want to see Wolf's face after everything she went through. Then he decides to clear up some doubts and asks Wolf what a beastman like him is doing in this place. But before that, he picks up a stone from the ground that had fallen from the enemy and says he's never seen one like it in his past life. Upon touching it, the protagonist is overwhelmed by a strange energy. He wonders if this might be demonic chi. Inside the stone, he sees a silver wolf trying to escape. The wolf lunges at the protagonist, leaving Tiny quite surprised by the sight. Back in the past, a friend of the protagonist wanted to show him something about spirit creatures. These creatures are beings that are reborn after accumulating mana for at least a century. Tiny didn't know such beings lived outside Elbapane, but he had heard that these spirit creatures were rare. His friend asked if he knew that the soul of a spirit creature was a spirit. He answered yes, even though he wasn't a spirit tamer. She then asked if he knew what the quintessence of a spirit was. As she spoke, she held a stone in her hand, similar to the one the protagonist now held. Back in the present, he wondered why a werewolf possessed such a precious item. Tiny also thought it was in a strange state since this object was emanating demonic chi, which was typically found in demon spirit stones. Regardless, he knew he needed to deal with this strange thing in the form of chains. So, he punched the spirit creature. With that, the chains broke. In the protagonist's mind, some scenes appeared. Scenes he identified as the spirit's memories. He wondered why, in the memory, the spirit was surrounded by strange individuals. He also noticed that all of them had demonic chi, and they were using it to fight the creature, even as it tried to resist its enemies. The spirit wolf couldn't defeat them. With knives infused with demonic chi, they attacked the wolf and managed to bring it down. After that, the protagonist saw that they were after the spirit stone. He also saw that a boy held the stone and handed it to another member of the group. The one who received it transformed into a werewolf. This way, the protagonist realized they were creating beastmen by making them absorb spirit stones. It became clear that Wolf had been a child transformed in this way, but since the protagonist arrived too early this time, Wolf hadn't fully absorbed the power. That's why Wolf appeared different from how Tiny remembered him. Then, the spirit wolf tried to attack Wolf, but the protagonist stopped it, saying that this guy deserved a more miserable death. He realized the spirit understood him and thought it was incredible since he was sure he had no talent for taming spirits or animals. But he remembered his friend saying that it was possible for a human to become a spirit tamer as long as they had a pure soul and enough mana. However, she had also said that only young children were pure enough to do so. Now he realized he had returned to his childhood state. However, he didn't think he was pure in the way his friend Estina had described. The wolf stared at him and approached the boy. Tiny realized the wolf believed that when he broke the stone, his mana entered the spirit stone, filling the broken part of the spirit stone. This was why they could communicate. As a result, Tiny asked if he could make a contract with the spirit wolf. The spirit answered yes, so the protagonist agreed to form the contract. Unlike magic, this didn't require him to focus on the spirit, and as long as the protagonist supplied the wolf with enough mana to survive, it would be a valuable ally, and most spirits grew stronger as the spirit tamer's strength increased. This was one of the reasons why Estina was one of the best among the 10 knights. But now, the protagonist realized the wolf wanted a favor, as it sought to use him to fulfill its revenge. Tiny said it wasn't a big deal. He explained that he was already planning to kill everyone connected with demonic chi. He knew the final step in contracting a spirit was deciding its name, so he wondered what he should call the wolf. Noticing that the animal had fur as silver as the moon, he decided to name it Lunar Wolf from now on. By the way, he wondered who was behind this man transforming others into beasts with spirit stones. Seeing that he had demonic chi, they might be what the protagonist described as them, the demon worshippers. Fanatics who rejected God and worked for demons. They had caused chaos in the world even before the Demon King's army appeared. Tiny had been stuck in a labyrinth during that time, so he didn't know much about it. Wolf is still begging for mercy, but the protagonist tells him to shut up and asks if the boy who gave him the spirit stone was a demon worshipper. But Wolf can't even respond, as he is out of his mind. The protagonist then asks the Lunar Wolf to wake him up. With a roar, Wolf snaps back to reality, and the protagonist repeats the question. Wolf mentions an organization, and the protagonist demands more details. However, the deranged man is not thinking straight. He says the organization won't let Tiny get away with this thing so easily. He also claims that he himself was just a test subject for them. Finally, he starts to mention the great power they possess. But before he can finish, his head explodes. Even the protagonist is surprised. He hadn't expected they would place a spell to prevent Wolf from revealing secrets, though, upon reflection, something like this had happened before. In the past, Tiny had thought Wolf was referring to his subordinates on the first floor when he spoke of the organization coming after him. When the protagonist dealt with those men, they didn't even know Wolf was a beast man. For now, Tiny decides to brush it off, saying it's not as if he lives using his head. Looking at the broken wall, he sees something that seems important, and he thinks he should start reclaiming what was taken from him. Next, he uses Wolf's body to break the wall further. Soon, a type of vault is revealed, and the protagonist wonders what the Sword Emperor would have done in this situation. He believes he can someday use the story the Emperor told him before he died. Tiny takes Wolf's hand and uses it to open the vault. He thinks that, to make his future ally trust him, he needs a specific item, which he finds inside the vault, the Valencia family ring. Once, a woman approached a boy and asked his name. He replied that his name was Tiny. She said the name was cute and suited him. Then, she took a ring from her finger and gave it to him, saying he should look for her with it, and she would help him. Back in the present, the protagonist knows that everyone living in the Aslan Empire knows who she is. Khloe von Valencia. She is the youngest daughter of the Sword Emperor, Asgard von Valencia. She is also known for her kindness and generosity since she was a child. Back then, she was called the Angel of Valencia. Everything changed around the time she turned 16 because there is a tradition in the Valencia family where children who reach adulthood must place flowers in every temple in the empire and make their names known. This must be the reason they met an invader, the red light district of the Files fiefdom, located on the borders of the duchy. In his past life, Tiny was unable to retrieve the ring because it took too long to seek vengeance, and getting help was difficult. But this time, the ring will be of great help. Now that it's in his possession, it should be much easier to meet the Sword Emperor. Suddenly, someone appears, asking about the protagonist, and Tiny already knew this person would show up. A man in shining armor enters the scene, and is met with the chaos everywhere. Some people mention how the protagonist grabbed one of their legs and swung it as a weapon, convinced he must be a mana user. The man is surprised to hear that a child caused all this commotion, but others confirm it and beg the knight to intervene, as this guarantees the problem will be resolved. However, irritated, the knight says this is why he told them to stop that nonsense, though they insist it's not related. The man then asks how Wolf has been managing his subordinates. This man is Ian, the commander of the guards of the outer castle of Files. He quickly thinks he can use his title as an excuse to increase his protection fee. But then the protagonist descends the stairs, and the knight asks if he was the one who caused all this mess. Tiny responds that he was. The commander then asks if he has any idea what he has just done. Tiny replies that he was just taking care of some rotten scum and doesn't understand why a knight needs to show up for something like that. He also mentions that it looks like the man was receiving a lot of bribes from Wolf. Despite being irritated, the man says the boy has guts, but that doesn't stop him from launching an attack. The protagonist wonders if the knight has just reached the second level of mana. In any case, he prevents the knight from attacking him, leaving the man quite surprised, as he did not expect his attack to be so easily stopped. Since that's the case, the protagonist thinks that even though he isn't strong, if he gives it his best, he might defeat his opponent. After this, he attacks with a knee strike to the opponent's face. The impact of the blow is powerful, but the knight blocked it with his hands, preventing greater damage. This makes Tiny think that, for now, just demonstrating his power should be enough. The knight comments that he's quite skilled for a child, but the protagonist can only think that he shouldn't make the feudal lord his enemy just yet, since the number of knights under the lord's command is too many. For now, Tiny decides it's better to let the knight leave on his own. Furious, the knight prepares to draw his sword. However, the protagonist is ready. From the top of the stairs, he summons his spirit wolf, facing the creature head-on. The knight becomes visibly frightened. This makes Tiny think that the opponent has probably never seen a spirit in such a small fief, and since the knight has calmed down, he decides to say something. The protagonist then states that this matter doesn't concern the opponent as long as he gets paid. The knight asks what he's getting at. The protagonist then asks what the knight thinks about being paid by him instead of Wolf. The knight remarks that such words don't sound like they're coming from a child, asking how old the protagonist is and whether he transforms through magic. Tiny replies that it's not magic. He says he's just a native of this place, and is somewhat famous an invader because of his black hair. The knight then asks if he thinks he can pay him the 5 white gold coins that Wolf would give. However, Tiny says he must be joking and asks how far the knight wants to take this. Because he's certain the knight was only receiving 1 coin from Wolf, Tiny agrees to raise the payment to 1.5 coins. This enrages the knight, but Tiny says that if he doesn't want the deal, they can settle the matter right now. Seeing that the boy has the protection of a spirit wolf, the knight realizes he has no chance against him. He remarks that the world must truly be ending, as only then would a child speak such things. Tiny then asks the knight for his answer. The knight says his payment date is the last day of the month, so Tiny must keep his promise. As he leaves, one of those present asks if the Lord's knight will really let things end like this. Angrily, the knight punches the man in the face and simply tells him to shut up. Tiny tells the knight to wait and tosses a coin in his direction, saying that since the ownership of this place has changed, the new owner should at least greet the feudal lord, and asks if the knight can arrange a meeting. The knight replies that he will report this to the lord, but warns the protagonist that he'll feel the feudal lord's wrath if he doesn't pay on time. Tiny says he's aware of that, and thinks that this will only happen if there's a next payment date. Seeing Wolf's former subordinates fleeing, the protagonist asks where they think they're going and declares he'll give them 1 hour to gather all the women working in Invader and the children who beg in the streets. He warns that for every minute they're late, he'll kill one person, and if they try to escape, his spirit will hunt them down and kill them. He then tells them to run and not forget that they only have 1 hour. Afterward, Tiny thinks that if everything goes according to his plan, it won't take even a week to deal with this place, and he looks forward to meeting Duke Valencia. When the deadline is up, the men return with the people the protagonist demanded. Emma is among them. As soon as she sees Tiny, she asks what happened to his hand and if someone hit him again. However, he replies that it's not his blood and points to Wolf, saying that he's already dead. Emma wonders if this is really Wolf. Quickly, panic spreads among the others, as they believe the feudal lord won't leave them alone now. Tiny notices that everyone is scared because no one living in Invader is unaware that the feudal lord is behind Wolf. The people begin to wonder what will happen and what kind of punishment they'll face, but the protagonist interrupts them, asking them that, if challenging the nobility is a grave sin, what will happen to the feudal lord of Files, who is making Duke Valencia look like a fool? Elsewhere, 2 guards are talking, and one of them mentions that he hasn't seen Lord Ram around for a few days, asking if he's on vacation or something. The other guard says he heard that Ram is on probation because of that incident in Invader. His friend asks what the Lord did. He asks if his friend doesn't remember the fight between the local thugs. His friend asks if he means the time when they all hallucinated simultaneously, because no matter how they were questioned about that moment, they all said the same thing about a giant wolf chasing them. The guard says he remembers now, and not only that, but the leader of those men was unrecognizable when they found the body, and all the money the former boss had simply disappeared. But he asks what that has to do with Lord Ram. His friend responds that it seems while he was negotiating with the new boss, they had a problem. All the shops and warehouses were closed, and the merchants who visited the city have many complaints, as they are no longer making money, which has angered the feudal lord. He also says that's likely why the feudal lord summoned the new boss. While they are talking, the protagonist listens in, hidden, back to the moment when he was talking with the people. Emma asks Tiny what he is talking about. The protagonist knows that in his past life, he used to believe all nobles were the same, so even after looking at the ledger, he didn't think much of it. As part of the feudal lord's request, he handed over half of Wolf's fortune and the ledger. In return, he gained only some knowledge about Invader. But things are different now. Even though Tiny isn't the smartest person in the world, due to his past life as a knight, he realized there are nobles who are above other nobles. And with this ledger, the feudal lord is finished. So he tells Emma that she doesn't have to understand this now, as it's not very important. Tiny says the most important thing now is that no one in Invader has to worry about Wolf anymore, and everyone there is free. Emma asks if this is true. The protagonist confirms it and says that if they want revenge or need to vent, now is their last chance. Then he points to Wolf's body. Soon, Emma remembers all the terrible things he did, and anger overtakes her. With that, she takes the opportunity to vent her rage on the corpse. Emma says she was the daughter of a prosperous merchant, and after Wolf ruined their lives, her father couldn't survive. Seeing Emma act this way encourages the others, who also want revenge, especially for those who died after being beaten by Wolf. The furious women vent their anger on the dead body. Meanwhile, Tiny thinks he has no talent for comforting people. Moreover, it doesn't suit his style of repaying a debt, because he believes this won't be enough to heal all the wounds. Even so, he opens Wolf's vault and tells them they can take as much as they want, figuring there's nothing better than money to help a bit with the process. Tiny says that this money belonged to Wolf, and any woman or child who is forced to stay in Invader should take the money and leave. They don't understand why he is offering this. Emma asks what will happen to the protagonist, but he says he'll be fine and that she should take the money she needs. The girl says Tiny might not understand this because he is still young, but claims there's no one in this world who doesn't need money. The protagonist asks where she thinks that money came from, stating that even if he sends all the bad guys to hell, the money will remain on Earth. Seeing the amount, the women get excited, but the protagonist has something to say. He warns that if they commit any wrongdoing because of the money or speak a single word to the feudal lord, he will send his spirit wolf to take care of the rest, claiming that the wolf will track them all down and tear them to pieces. Then he tells Emma that if she's thinking of leaving Files, he recommends going to Diane. He also advises always traveling in groups and hiring mercenaries from a guild with a good reputation. However, Emma doesn't want to leave without him, but Tiny says he has another place to go, and she agrees, believing he is strong enough to take care of himself. Then she says they'll do as he suggested and go to Diane. Soon, she invites the protagonist to find her if his path becomes too difficult. Tiny says goodbye and thanks Emma for everything. From that day on, Tiny decreed that the red light district of Files, Invader, is closed. Back to the guards reminiscing about what happened, Tiny introduces himself. They see the boy and ask how long he's been there. They say this is the place where the Lord lives, and an ordinary civilian shouldn't be sneaking around. But one of them asks how the boy knows the name of the new boss. Tiny responds that he is the new boss. To prove it, he shows his wolf to the guards. They immediately run inside. After that, he manages to stand before a noble, but since he has the body of a child, he has to deal with others looking down on him all the time. The Grand Master of the Files Order of Knights, Kron, says he heard from Ram about Tiny but thinks the boy is quite young. Tiny simply asks if it is the local etiquette to keep their guests waiting while they observe them. The Grand Master soon becomes irritated and says the boy needs to know where he is. The protagonist says the same to him, telling the man not to mess around pretending to be superior to the feudal lord. He also says that he is a guest of the feudal lord, and despite knowing this clearly, the Grand Master is trying to point his sword at him. The man replies that, as expected of someone who lives in filth, his tongue clearly stinks. Tiny says he didn't know about that, but to be honest, the stench is coming from the man, specifically from the foulest mouth in the Order of Knights. This infuriates the Grand Master, but the butler tries to calm him down, saying the Lord is waiting. Master Kron knows this very well, and the protagonist is relieved that he no longer has to wait. The Grand Master then sheathes his sword, and warns the boy to be careful inside because the Lord is someone very strict. In his thoughts, Kron affirms that he will kill the boy as soon as he has the Lord's permission. Anyway, the protagonist goes to meet the Lord, and Kron introduces him to the Lord as Tiny from the alleys. The Lord then tells him to come in. As soon as the protagonist enters the room, he is shocked, wondering if that thing is the feudal lord. Nevertheless, the protagonist maintains his composure, saying it is an honor to meet the governor of Files. The Lord asks where he learned such etiquette. Tiny responds that he has been practicing for a while in preparation for this moment. His name is Baron Jaimin Val Files, and after this, the Lord says the protagonist is very good at pretending to be a gentleman. Tiny hears this and thinks he can't get used to it. He also wonders if this is the same feudal lord he once knew. He remembers that back then, the Lord was addicted to drugs, so he wonders if this was the Lord's appearance before he started using drugs. But putting that aside, the Lord was a noble in his past life and still is one. In any case, the account book going to the Duke of Valencia will be his undoing, thanks to the protagonist. Regardless, Tiny wants his proper revenge this time, and the Lord says it seems the protagonist does not show the same courtesy to Master Kron. Tiny asks how the attitude of someone toward his master and toward one of the master's servants could be the same. He also says he wishes to be one of the Lord's servants. The Grand Master can't believe what he's hearing. But in other words, the Lord says the protagonist considers the Grand Master his rival, and to him, it seems the protagonist has great ambitions. However, he asks if the protagonist is sure he is young, suggesting he might be a half-blood elf or dwarf. Tiny, in turn, responds no and claims to be only 13 years old, which surprises them. The Lord, however, says it doesn't matter, as the protagonist is now before his eyes. But for someone who wishes to be his servant, he states that the protagonist stole his money, and asks if the boy would mind explaining this. Tiny responds that he did it for the Lord's own good. The Lord says he thought the boy was clever for his age, but it seems he still doesn't know how this world works. In turn, the Grand Master says that if the Lord wishes, he can eliminate the boy right now. But Tiny asks if the Lord knew that the Duke of Valencia has started a crackdown on drug trafficking and prostitution. This leaves the Grand Master extremely surprised. The protagonist claims to know that the Lord is aware Miss Valencia visited his land and acquired this information from her company. Tiny says he just wanted to clear things up for the Lord before it turned into chaos. He thinks this is the truth, so it doesn't matter if the Lord investigates it personally. The Lord says he heard about it during the coming-of-age ceremony for the youngest daughter of the Valencia family. They were planning something big. After that, the Grand Master tells the Lord that all of this is just the false ideas of a child and that Valentino is full of brothels. But the Lord interrupts him, telling Kron not to overstep boundaries, so he apologizes. Then the Lord says that if the protagonist is telling the truth, despite the rough methods, it is something to be praised. Tiny thanks him, but the Lord says there is one more thing he needs to confirm. He states that he knows the boy controls the spirit of a wolf. He asks if it is a spirit the boy stole from the spirit wolf stone. The protagonist wonders how the Lord knows that. but then the lunar wolf manifests, and it uses its aura to make the protagonist see through the Lord. With that, he can perceive a circle made of demonic energy surrounding the man. Soon Tiny imagines this can only mean that the Lord is a black mage. He knows that demons never lend their power without sacrifices. A second circle mage is certainly a lunatic who has already killed hundreds of people or made sacrifices. Tiny remembers that one of the guys who wanted to take his sister's body mentions something about this. Not only that, but when he faced the brothers at Wolf's house, they also mentioned something similar. With that, he concludes that the Lord is the one who has been buying bodies from the invaders all this time. Not only that, but he also realizes that Wolf had a black mage behind him all along. Due to the protagonist's delay, the Lord asks why he is not speaking, but Tiny claims he did not understand the question. Then he orders Kron to attack. The protagonist realizes this is a problem because, with his current power, he won't be able to defeat these two. So, he tells the lunar wolf to attack. Seeing the wolf, the Lord says it truly is the master of the forest, and he cannot accept that such a spirit is in the protagonist's possession. Now that things have come to this, the Lord says they have no choice but to find a new test subject. Tiny then realizes that the Lord wants to use him in place of Wolf. The Lord asks how powerful this boy is. The Grand Master responds that he will soon reach level 2, so the Lord understands that he is already a match for a knight. Kron agrees unless he comes from a notable family that trained him to manipulate mana from an early age, making the boy a genius. However, he states it is impossible for him to have learned all this on his own because there isn't a single drop of mana leaking from him, and the circulation is also stable. The protagonist says he learned this due to a secret legacy from his family. Soon, the Lord asks if the boy can answer him correctly now. Tiny thinks he should simply say that someone taught him this, as he knows they wouldn't believe him if he said he developed it on his own. So, he tells the Lord that he learned it from his distant relatives before coming to Files. He also says it is a breathing technique he learned in childhood, and as his strength grew, he realized it was a special method. In his thoughts, he wishes the Lord good luck trying to guess whether what he just said is true or not, because he knows the Lord accepted refugees from everywhere to increase the income source of the invaders, and it will be impossible to track his records. After that, Tiny says that the fact he is standing in front of the Lord would be proof of his words. Then the Lord says he will trust what the boy says, making the protagonist think it was easier than he imagined. But then, the Lord says the only certainty is that he will judge. The protagonist doesn't know who he is. Even so, the Lord tells him to stay around for a few days. Since he killed Wolf, some things are causing problems. Then the Lord states he will have to pin the blame on someone. This makes the protagonist think he must be referring to the members of that organization Wolf mentioned. And he considers that if the feudal lord is as cautious as he is, he might be an incredible black mage, making this very dangerous. The Lord interrupts his thoughts, demanding an answer from the boy. He also says he wants the protagonist to be his sword, adding that this shouldn't be a bad offer. Tiny simply says that if the Lord orders it, he will accept, believing himself to be a special guest. The Lord confirms this, saying the boy should be very careful with his actions in his presence. In his thoughts, Tiny notes that he still has a card to play. It will take about 3 days for the Duke's men to identify whether the account book is genuine or fake. Another 3 days for the punitive army to be assembled. And about 10 more days for the army to arrive in Files, maybe a little over 15 days. However, if the Lord's guest arrives after this period, everything will work out. So, he asks the Lord when his guest will arrive. The Lord does not understand why he is asking. Tiny says his wish is to know this so he can use as much time as possible to learn proper manners. The Lord then says his guest will arrive in a week and tells the boy not to disappoint him. With this news, the protagonist becomes deeply concerned. Now the protagonist knows he has only 1 week to prepare. He realizes he has only 2 options. The first is to flee, as the people of Invader must already be far away by now. He could leave if he wanted, imagining that escaping from the Lord's men would be easy to do. However, if he does so, he is certain the Lord will put him on the wanted list, and if that happens, things will become even more problematic, especially when he tries to meet the Sword Emperor, and since he receives something from him, Tiny must avoid anything that could cause trouble. But that's not the only thing bothering him. Just thinking about having to flee irritates him, even though he doesn't yet have the same strength as in his past life. Finding a way to overcome his opponents has always been his way of doing things. As for the second option, this guest arriving in a week, the protagonist wonders if it is really the Lord's official visitor. He remembers that the feudal lord referred to this person as if they were some kind of high nobility. But he questions why the house is so empty, considering a guest is about to arrive. Tiny concludes this must be some kind of obscure private visit, and definitely the person supporting the feudal lord is not someone who can show themselves in public. If that's really the case, He wonders what would happen if some kind of major unforeseen event occurred in files before this guest's arrival. He imagines that a lot of attention would be focused on one place, and there's a great chance this visit could be postponed or cancelled. Even though there's a high risk of failure, Tiny always approaches things this way. But for this specific task, the protagonist knows he needs to become stronger. And with that, he will be able to defeat the Grand Master and the Lord. After some time, he stops his training, because he feels hungry and wants to find something to eat. In the dining hall, the cook is startled by what he sees and ends up spilling hot soup. The person he was serving asks where he's looking, but when that person also sees the scene, they are equally surprised, because they see the protagonist eating an absurd amount of food and wonder how he can eat so much, speculating that he might have dwarf blood, as they've heard dwarves eat as much as orcs. For his part, Tiny thinks his mana body, which has surpassed dissonance, improves whenever he eats. In other words, the more he eats, the stronger he becomes. And since that's the case, Tiny doesn't need any medicinal herbs or anything of the sort. But upon seeing him eating this way, a knight approaches and asks if the boy learned good manners from a dog. The protagonist simply responds that he did. The man becomes irritated and tells the boy to act respectfully when in front of an adult. Tiny asks how he can respect someone who is picking a fight with a little boy, further irritating the man. He continues, saying he's not sure if the knight is trying to make him laugh or looking for a fight, and tells him to decide quickly. His provocations leave the man extremely furious. Then he lets his anger get the best of him, saying he's going to beat the protagonist, seeing his colleague about to explode. Another knight tries to calm him down, stating the protagonist is just a child. However, the one who tried to calm him down is reprimanded, because the Grand Master approaches, telling him to stay seated and not interfere. Tiny seems to have already figured everything out. With further provocations, he tells the knight that he can attack him with full force, claiming he thought the man wanted to know how strong he is. Hearing this, the knight tells the boy not to regret it later. With that, the protagonist simply thinks that the Grand Master should stay still and just watch. Not only that, but he also knows that the feudal lord is behind all of this. Outside the dining hall, everyone gathers to watch the fight between the two, including the Grand Master, who is the most eager. Next, the knight named Grant claims he will put the boy in his place. Tiny asks if he is really sure about that. Grant simply tells the boy to grab his sword, stating he will finish this quickly and asking if he's not scared now. However, Tiny scoffs at his opponent and doesn't even grab a weapon. Then, he lands a kick on the knight's shin, which causes him immense pain, but he tries to hold back so as not to show weakness. Next, he attempts to strike the boy. However, the protagonist is more agile than he expected. After that, Tiny prepares to deliver another kick, and ends up hitting his opponent's other leg. Grant can't believe he's been hit twice, wondering if this is really the power of a mere level 1. Looking at his leg, he notices it is already swollen, yet he thinks he cannot lose to a child. Meanwhile, the protagonist thinks his opponent is quite resilient, but driven by pure rage, the knight tries to attack him. Tiny once again manages to evade, and prepares to attack again, which leaves Grant even more astonished. Then, Tiny leaps toward his opponent, and grabs him with his legs. He tells Grant not to worry because he won't kill him. The protagonist merely knocks his opponent out, and loudly and ironically asks if knights are really this weak, leaving everyone else utterly surprised, because they can't believe that Sir Grant lost to a child. Tiny stares directly at the Grand Master, who, in turn, is furious about what happened, but he simply turns and leaves. The protagonist concludes that he intentionally defeated a knight in front of numerous people without the help of the lunar wolf. He knows there aren't many people capable of doing that. Now he thinks the feudal lord will become increasingly hesitant to get rid of him. With that, he says in his thoughts that the probability of success has increased. The protagonist loses his balance for a moment, and wonders if he overexerted himself, but he thinks he had no choice in such a situation since he had to use mana for this. If it were in his past life, he would have faced many problems, because while his body recovered quickly, he was still at a disadvantage due to the slow recovery of mana. However, in this life, his body is in harmony with his mana, so that disadvantage is a thing of the past. Now he can train as much as he wants, and he can become even stronger than in his previous life. The next day, the movements in the duchy turned out to be true, and the lord says he made a mistake with the protagonist. Tiny thanks him for his consideration and trust. The lord then tells him to enjoy the veal steak and feel free to eat the other dishes as well. With that, Tiny comments that it seems like a bit much for breakfast. However, the lord asks if his strength doesn't come from large quantities of food. The protagonist replies that what happened with that knight yesterday was a fluke. Hearing this, the lord tells him not to be modest, claiming that his future is very promising and lamenting that there isn't a good master to teach a genius like him. From what he has heard, the lord says the greatest knights in history grew up alone without masters. But Tiny says what made them grow was having a great lord to follow. The The Lord is surprised that the boy knows about history and etiquette, making it clear to him that the protagonist is no ordinary commoner. In his thoughts, Tiny says he had an entire previous life to learn these things. Returning to the Lord, he says that both in the Empire and in neighboring kingdoms, this type of ears, black hair, and black eyes are very rare. However, if you include that, it becomes difficult to guess. The protagonist doesn't understand what he means by that. In any case, the Lord says he never thought a foreigner could be worth so much. Once again, Tiny doesn't understand what he means, but the Lord says he will be able to explain in more detail. He talked about the protagonist to him, and it seems it pleased him a lot. Tiny doesn't understand any of it, and thinks that he is definitely a crazy drug addict. He also thinks that the Lord is only in such good condition because of the power of the circle, but one can never know when the demon will strike. In his past life, Tiny imagines that he must have abandoned the Lord and removed the circle. For his part, the Lord says that he is eager to meet the boy. He also says the protagonist cannot imagine how good he is and will definitely make great use of him. Tiny thanks him for this precious opportunity. After the meal, he returns to his training. The protagonist is worried about him and the organization, but he thinks now is not the time to dwell on that, as he needs to prepare. He knows that the Lord is in the second circle, and Matukakran, of the second stage, is slightly stronger but still comparable, because the level of a mage and a mana user are similar, and the protagonist passed the second stage a long time ago in his past life. But now, he has to reach that level again and imagines that 6 days will be enough. 3 days after this realization, he notes that his body is still small but already quite strong. Just as much as his strength and weight were compressed, his elasticity has increased, and his movements are even better than in his past life. It seems that Tiny has rebuilt the foundation entirely and thinks that perhaps the problem was his monstrous size. In his previous life, he only wanted to be big and strong, and his body, connected to his mana, responded to that unconsciously. The harmony between his body and his mana was broken because he grew too large. But now that he has reverted to a child state, he concludes he doesn't need to be so big to be strong. While training, however, he notices some movement. A few guards appear and identify him as the boy who defeated Lord Grant. They then leave, saying it's better to return later. Tiny feels grateful that they are avoiding him, giving him more space to train. After eating heavily for 3 days, and training for hours with the dummies, everyone eventually loses their curiosity. Now, they slowly start avoiding him. However, the captain approaches. The protagonist asks what he wants. The captain tells Tiny to follow him because the Lord has instructed them to give the boy a weapon. Upon seeing the enemy's sword, Tiny thinks the timing couldn't be more perfect. The captain says the boy doesn't realize how much the Lord thinks of and cares for him. He tells him to be grateful. Meanwhile, the protagonist looks around. He sees an armor set, which he thinks is very expensive but fits him perfectly. However, when looking at the weapons, he doesn't see any axes or war hammers, and he thinks he will need to spend his savings. After this, he asks the captain if he can take something like his sword. The captain asks if his sword looks like something mass-produced. He says the sword's name is Grills, crafted by Rogers, a renowned swordsmith, and it is a luxury artifact. He also says that a little bird doesn't eat stones. Yet the protagonist can only think about how much blood must have been spilled by that sword. Even so, he says that the sword suits him more than the captain, claiming that this sword should be in the hands of someone more talented for the Lord's sake. Hearing this, the captain bites back his anger, calling the boy insolent, and asks if he's trying to get himself killed. But the protagonist asks if he wants to test his skills right now. He then holds the sword as if it weighs nothing, saying that if he loses, he will hand his head to the opponent on a platter. As if the captain wasn't furious enough, this provocation makes him attack the boy with all his strength. Outside the armory, the guards only hear the commotion and listen to the protagonist apologizing, saying he'll be more careful. But then the boy walks out of the room, and though injured, he is carrying the sword he wanted so much. The guards who see this wonder if Captain Kron hit a child, thinking that even though Tiny is exceptionally skilled for his age, this will be a problem. They also wonder if it's true that the captain dislikes this boy, as rumors suggest the protagonist might even take the captain's place in the future. Still, they think it's wrong for a captain to hit a child. But in any case, they decide it's none of their business and go about their lives. As he walks through the corridors, some maids, upon seeing the protagonist injured, ask what happened to him. Tiny replies that the captain said they were going to fetch a weapon and he agreed to go with him, and then this happened. The maids then tell him to go rest and call them if he needs anything. Back in the Lord's chamber, he asks what is happening with the sacrifice. His servant replies that it is secure, so the Lord asks if more bodies appeared again today. The servant confirms, and the Lord thinks that this boy is turning the invaders upside down. With that, he dismisses the servant, and says he doesn't know what the boy is plotting, but he thinks he has to put an end to it, because he imagines that in a few days, the boy's lineage will be confirmed, and then they will be able to proceed. There's just one problem, as the Lord thinks that if the protagonist belongs to that family, then of course he, as the owner of that wolf, will have to pay a terrible price. However, he hopes that won't happen because seeing how knowledgeable and well-mannered he is, it's clear the protagonist came from a family of great prestige. Moreover, even though he is very talented, someone his age could never defeat a knight, probably because he must have mastered the vision of that family. And above all, the protagonist has those black eyes and hair. For the Lord, there's no clearer evidence than this, and he can't wait to see him. However, as he lies down to sleep, he hears a sound called an alarm spell. He wonders if it's a servant? If so, he wants to know who would dare disturb him unnecessarily, claiming that he will take this person and use them as a sacrifice. Then he tries to rise from his bed, but soon after, he sees someone approaching with a sword, and unable to defend himself, he is struck directly. The Lord can only scream in pain and spit blood. Tiny, who attacked him, says this is divine punishment. Even injured, the Lord asks why he was attacked, but the protagonist doesn't care and stabs his heart, until the Lord bleeds to death. Afterward, he leaves the Lord's chamber, and leaves the sword embedded in the body. The next morning, at dawn, one of the maids finds the Lord's body and screams. Thus, the other servants also gather, and some notice that the Lord was a black mage. One of the knights says that the priest was already there and mentioned he could detect demonic energy, so he would report it to the parish. His name is Glenn, a member of the Philias Knights, and he says an investigative team from the Empire will be sent soon. Another guard asks why the Lord's body remains like this. He thinks it has already been several hours since the Lord died, because they say the bodies of black mages rot immediately after death. They find this situation horrible and wonder why the Lord made that choice. Glenn thinks the Lord abandoned the lineage and honor of being an imperial noble and was executed as soon as it was discovered. Then he says there's no way to question a dead person, but there's still something unclear. After that, he examines the sword more closely and realizes it's the captain's sword. However, the others don't believe the captain would do such a thing. One of them mentions that the boy managed to meet the Lord alone, given his excellent skills. He also says there was talk about a new captain, so he concludes the current one might have snapped after hearing this. Another guard asks if he would kill the Lord just for that. He wouldn't do such a thing unless he was insane. However, they question, if that's the case, why hasn't the captain appeared yet? Glenn says he has a bad feeling about this, and decides to do some investigations. Soon, he talks to several people, and after interviewing all the guards and servants, he discovers that the captain beat Tiny a day ago. Finally, they gather all the testimonies, and Glenn tells them to summon the boy. Facing Glenn, the protagonist says the captain mentioned that the Lord ordered him to fetch a weapon, so he accompanied him to the armory. But he didn't imagine that all along. The captain just wanted to beat him, and furthermore, he didn't receive any weapon. Glenn becomes irritated, stating that the warehouse has already been inspected, claiming that there were some traces, but the captain wasn't there, and no one has seen him anywhere, alleging that the captain vanished like a ghost after meeting the boy. Then he asks if the protagonist truly didn't meet the captain after that. Glenn insists on his question, but the protagonist states that he did not meet the captain. Then, Glenn asks if he doesn't find that strange. Tiny says he's somewhat worried that Glenn isn't taking him seriously. He also says he's not happy to hear that but insists he's telling the truth. Glenn thinks this matches the testimony of the staff. Showing concern, the protagonist asks what will happen to him, claiming that the master had said his future was secured. Glenn simply tells the boy to come back there earlier, and then lets him go. Tiny thinks that this knight is one of the bastards living there but wonders why he doesn't remember him, and asks himself if he just forgot. But after thinking about it carefully, he remembers perfectly killing all of them in his past life. He then thinks it would be suspicious if he returned to the room after being interrogated, concluding he cannot be careless. After some time, he returns to the room, and receives a mercenary plate and money from Glenn. Glenn says that only commoners with the status of mercenary or merchant can freely enter other provinces, affirming that he personally verified the identity. Tiny thinks he really wanted one of those, but he asks why he's being given it out of the blue. The knight tells the boy that playing around in a rotten place will only waste his talents, and advises him to go play in better places, claiming that this is advice from a life veteran. Upon hearing this, Tiny thinks this is advice the knight himself wishes to follow. Now he understands why he hasn't seen him before. Glenn must have left the place. Regardless, Tiny thanks him and says he thought he should leave anyway. He thinks that now that the Black Mage is dead, the Imperial family must act. The protagonist prevented him from making a move, but the Duke's investigation team hasn't appeared. So, he concludes that he'll have to go personally. Glenn tells the protagonist that if he succeeds on his journey, he must not forget about him. Tiny asks what his name is again, and Glenn is shocked that the boy doesn't know his name. A bit embarrassed, he introduces himself as Glenn Liberty but says the boy can just call him Glenn. The protagonist then says that Glenn also needs to remember his name. Then he leaves, saying that Phileas is without a lord as its leader. At the moment, everything is in the hands of that knight. In a way, Tiny feels guilty, as the knight said he would need a mage specialized in tracking to find the captain. Thus, Tiny has left an unsolvable problem behind, and now that he has a mercenary plate, he plans to borrow a horse from the guild for transportation. But immediately, the lunar wolf appears. The protagonist understands that the wolf is offering itself as a mount but says riding it gives too many jolts over long distances. Not only that, but he claims that a human riding a wolf's back will vomit everything in their stomach within 10 minutes, arguing that he is too slender to have the same balance as an orc. But the wolf doesn't care and forces the protagonist onto its back. Tiny, in turn, comments that the animal is still a bit small, because spirits usually materialize at the size they had when alive, but they can also materialize in proportion to the mage's size. While using the wolf as a mount, Tiny realizes that their souls and senses must first become one, and so he decides to try. Soon, he uses a level 2 spiritualist ability, Condemnation of Sensory Soul Link. Immediately, the wolf's body begins to transform. It becomes stronger than before, surprising the protagonist with this. He remembers his old friend asking what could be done by becoming a spiritualist, claiming that each domain is different. But the mage's traits manifest in the spirit. Strength and endurance, those are the mage's traits. But shortly afterward, the wolf takes off. It runs at an astonishing speed. The protagonist notices that all his senses are heightened, as they are connected to the wolf's senses, his vision and his sense of smell. He imagines he will save a lot of time reaching Valencia and concludes he can travel farther and faster this way, possibly even reaching Curran, where the first catastrophe will occur. In his previous life, as if heralding the arrival of the Demon King, many catastrophes emerged one after another, which greatly weakened humanity's strength. It all began with the disappearance of Curran's relic, something the protagonist thinks he must prevent from happening. The treasures of humanity granted by the goddess, the 7 sacred relics. This was supposed to be the final sacrifice, but in his past life, these relics were stolen. However, in this life, Tiny wants to overcome all these disasters and become the greatest warrior because he wants to join the human army against the Demon King. The first catastrophe in Curran, the Kingdom of the Sea, is where the protagonist wants to go, right after visiting the Duke's house. At another moment, people notice that the Imperial family is sending an investigation team for the Lord's murder. There are even rumors that he was a black mage. With this, they wonder if they'll end up being affected. A man talks to his friend and says it's better to be careful just to be safe, and his friend says it's better to stay out of it for now. But gradually, they notice a strange mist approaching, emanating around a mysterious person. The city guards demand that this person identify themselves. However, the person refuses, and passes through the city gate with no difficulty, leaving the guards collapsed at the entrance. At night, in the Lord's palace, Glenn is still awake working. However, he notices a strange presence, and asks the person who they are. But the hooded figure, instead of answering, says they have some questions, demanding that the knight tell them everything he knows about the Lord's death. Using magic, they enchant the knight. Enchanted, Glenn has no choice but to obey, and begins to reveal what he knows. The person asks where the Lord's body is. Glenn says that, at the request of the Empire's investigation team, it was placed in a coffin in his room. The hooded figure says that's excellent, and tells the knight to go to sleep and wake up in an hour. After the set time, Glenn wakes up disoriented and remembers nothing. He assumes he has been overworked, which is why he blacked out. But then, one of the guards approaches, saying they have a problem because the Lord's body has disappeared. This leaves Glenn desperate, as the body was definitive evidence of black magic. Far from the palace, in the forest outside Phileas, the hooded figure has the sword that killed the Lord, and finds the body of the sword's owner, already abandoned and dead. They quickly conclude that the culprit must be the dark-haired boy, who defeated the wolf and disappeared shortly after the incident, vowing that he will pay for ruining the organization's work. The next day, at the west gate of Valencia, Tiny is about to enter and thinks that many people really come to this city. He also thinks that everything is still going well but believes that if he moves first, everything could fall apart. So, he wants to get his equipment soon, feeling even grateful for Glenn's kindness. But he says this is already too much. Tiny pulls 2 gold coins from his pouch, and this quickly draws attention, as he is approached by 2 armed bandits asking if he has money. They demand that the protagonist hand over everything he has. But the tables are about to turn, when the protagonist asks if they have money. In his previous life, there was an unspoken rule on the continent's dark side. If a large shadow appeared in an alley, people should hide and not even breathe. But Tiny faced them, until one day when he was approached by a man saying that killing so many people like that could taint his soul. Soon, the day would come when he would be haunted by remorse, so he should show a little mercy. But at the time, the protagonist claimed he would be fine, stating he had never killed anyone. He had only dealt with leftovers of abortions multiple times. Back in the present, he faced several local bandits and collected their money. One of them curses the protagonist, saying they are from the Rufus family, the Knights. But Tiny claims they are so weak he has never heard of that name. Angry, they try to attack him again. In response, Tiny throws the bag of gold at one of their faces, and as the bandit is thrown back, his companion trembles, knowing he's next. Immediately, the protagonist lands a kick right in his face, and with the impact, he is also thrown back. With all the bandits lying on the ground, Tiny approaches the gold bag and picks it up. Seeing this, one of the bandits says his brother won't let this slide. But the protagonist is only interested in the amount of gold he got and even laughs in their faces. Now that he has the money he needed, he decides to visit a weapons shop. The shopkeeper then presents a leather and iron armor made in the southern mountains, claiming to be resistant to most arrows, which Tiny says seems quite useful. On the other side, some men are talking, and one of them says that, anyway, they can't get close, but the other says they can watch from afar. Hearing this piques the protagonist's curiosity, and he asks the vendor if there's an event happening. Since the boy didn't seem to know, the vendor tells him that the princess of Valencia is on patrol. Immediately, Tiny thinks that if Irina was the person who taught him about affection, then the princess is the first person who gave him any hope. Although it didn't end very well, thanks to that hope, he was able to leave Invader. Tiny wonders why these people changed his life, believing that if she can recognize his life, then she will know he is living according to her sister's liking. The last time they met in his past life, the princess laughed when Tiny introduced himself, claiming that his name had nothing to do with him. She even apologized and tried to keep her composure, but she couldn't hold back. Back in the present, Tiny thinks she must have already forgotten about him. However, he states that in this life, he will find her sooner, make her remember, and also secure a meeting with the emperor. Elsewhere, a man says that the city of Valencia is one of the largest in the central region. He is the eldest son of Count Lucent, named Edmund von Lucent. As he walks with the princess, he talks about the city's specialties, but she doesn't seem interested. Accompanied by an entire garrison, they continue walking. Edmund keeps talking about things the princess doesn't care about, but she has to fulfill her duties. So, she says she isn't interested in trade and asks if they could take a look at the poorer parts of the city. This question leaves Edmund very surprised, but the princess says they are also residents of this place. Feeling awkward at her response, he agrees to take her where she requested. The princess remembers her father saying that if she is receiving the education of an heir, she should learn about real things. He told her to take a look at the poor because they should have a better life, and only then will the country become a better place. The princess wonders if it's unusual for her to put into practice what her father taught her, believing that in her heart, she wants to change everyone's perception with reality. But when her fiancé is announced at her coming-of-age ceremony, she will no longer be free for the rest of her life. This makes her question whether she should seek refuge in the temple, as she has felt drawn to it for some time. However, she knows her father would be sad about it, and he wouldn't want her to live alone for the rest of her life. Amid her thoughts, she hears that a child is trying to approach. It was the protagonist confronting the guards. Edmund steps forward and asks who this boy is and where he came from, claiming that he must leave immediately. However, unexpectedly for them, Tiny takes out an item, and says this is a ring that the princess herself gave to him, claiming she said he should come see her, and even though he's late, he would like to greet her. The others think this is nonsense, except for the princess, as she recognizes the ring the boy is showing. But she says it's strange because she gave that ring to a poor child, and asks the protagonist how he got it. Realizing that the princess doesn't recognize him, Tiny now finds himself in trouble, as the guards point their swords at him, precisely because the princess thinks he stole the ring. With swords around his neck, the leader of the guards demands the boy explain himself. Tiny now thinks that they met too soon and says it may be hard to believe, but claims that the child is him. He thinks that maybe the princess doesn't recognize him because he suddenly grew up, so he decides to give more details, saying he was the only one with dark hair in Filias, and perhaps the only one in the entire duchy. The princess asks how that's possible because the boy she met was so frail and couldn't even speak properly. She also says he was so small and cute but was a pitiful boy. Thinking about it, the protagonist realizes that even if he were small and cute, he couldn't have done much. So, he decides to use his powers, and summons a small, cute animal for the princess, which she seems to like a lot. As she hugs the animal tightly, even though she's warned it's still a strange spirit. She, however, says that only very pure children can obtain a spirit like that. The protagonist knows this is true, but there's a catch. The leader of the guards analyzes him from head to toe, and notices that the boy has weapons and a spirit, becoming suspicious. On the other hand, the princess asks what the name of this cute animal is. Tiny replies that it's called lunar wolf, referring to the moon in the Eastern dialect. Such knowledge about the dialect also catches the leader of the guards' attention. unlike the princess, who is solely focused on the animal. She says she never imagined the protagonist could change so much in just 1 or 2 months, when he didn't even look like he was 10 years old back then. The princess also remembers that his name means tiny. Tiny says he's 13 years old now, and his growth sped up a bit after his mana awakened. Vivian, the head of the guards, says this is very suspicious and asks the protagonist about his true age and whether he's some kind of half-blood. She apologizes to the princess for her rudeness but claims it's her duty to keep the princess safe. Edmund speaks up, saying he also finds this suspicious and suggests it would be better to interrogate the boy after a quarantine. In turn, Tiny says he won't ask them to trust him but reminds them that the princess said she could help him when she gave him the ring before. Edmund becomes irritated at being ignored by the boy, but the princess agrees that the protagonist needs her help. Soon, Tiny asks if she thinks he can meet Lord Asgard von Valencia. Vivian, already annoyed, asks how the boy dares and claims he must be out of his mind. Tiny simply asks if they think a boy could do any harm to the Lord of Valencia. He says there are only 7 superhumans on the continent, and one of them is the Sword Emperor, who can wield the power of destruction. Therefore, someone like that could not be harmed by a mere boy. The princess says that the title, Sword Emperor, would greatly embarrass her father, and notes that it hasn't been long since he was listed as one of the 7 greatest knights on the continent. With that, the protagonist concludes that this has yet to happen. Vivian says that this is definitely a title that suits His Excellency. She also states that His Excellency's prestige has spread even to the most distant fields, and she feels relieved that they accepted it well. Next, Tiny says he would like to personally explain to the Duke what happened in Filias, as someone who was involved in the incident. Elsewhere, the princess asks if this really happened, and Vivian responds that it did. She then asks if the head of the guards is hiding anything else besides what Tiny said. Vivian replies no, claiming that the Empire's lord was a black mage, and that it seems someone else is behind it. The princess says Tiny experienced the situation personally and believes his testimony could be a very important clue. Moreover, she knows that Tiny asked to see her father and needs to return home. Vivian asks the princess how long she intends to hold on to that animal, as she is worried the wolf might hurt her. But the princess says it's just a cute thing, which doesn't seem to please the wolf. The head of the guards observes the wolf more closely and is also charmed by it, but she quickly tries to regain her composure. Meanwhile, the princess asks about Tiny. She says she doesn't know and only mentions that young Master Edmund took him, saying he wanted to talk to the boy alone. The princess grows curious about the conversation, but suddenly, the spirit wolf vanishes from her hands. Elsewhere, Edmund says that he and the protagonist can finally talk alone, and asks what the boy's name is again. He replies that it's Tiny. Edmund doesn't like how informal the boy is, but Tiny says there's something more important than that, and asks what Edmund knows about the black mage. The young master says he doesn't know anything about that, and claims to only understand why the boy is so arrogant. Soon, Tiny realizes Edmund lied, but the young master says the boy is very disrespectful and seems to lack any manners. Then, Edmund raises his hand to slap the protagonist, claiming he must learn proper manners. However, the protagonist grabs his hand, stopping Edmund from continuing. Edmund becomes very frustrated that he can't free his arm. He states that he will tell the princess about the boy's lack of manners, as he dared to use violence against a noble. However, the protagonist asks what kind of bizarre social status this is and says he'll handle it his way. But he wants to see what Edmund has prepared for him since he called him because he trusts him. Edmund doesn't like this attitude at all, but he tells the protagonist to follow him. Far away, Vivian mounts her horse, because the princess ordered her to go to Tiny immediately. She thought the princess might be exaggerating when she said this since the spirit might disappear if it's far from its master. But she knows Edmund took the boy to the outskirts of the castle. She rides off at full speed toward him, hoping it's not too late. As they walk to another place, Edmund leads the protagonist to a large mansion, but Tiny doesn't seem to care about it at all. After entering, a man asks how Edmund got there. He also asks if something happened, as the deadline is still far off, and he wonders why the young master has come for the product. They are the Rufus family, first in the hierarchy, and a bunch of fools. The protagonist dislikes this family, as he faced them before. Edmund, in turn, says he's not there for the product but demands that they educate this insolent commoner. One Rufus hesitates, unsure if he should do it, but Edmund slaps him, asking how he dares to question the orders of the duchy. Then Rufus says he understands. He immediately tells Eric and Tillman to go ahead. However, as soon as these two face the protagonist, they recognize him right away, because they were beaten by him when they tried to rob him. Sarcastically, Tiny greets them, and both of them are instantly terrified. The eldest asks why the two are hesitating. They respond that this is the boy they talked about before and ask Rufus to handle him. The eldest says the boy is unlucky and should have been more careful. Edmund, seeing Rufus, thinks he seems very confident and likes that. The big man, for his part, wants to end this quickly. but he is struck before he can do anything, and with the force of the blow, he is thrown to the other side of the room, falling unconscious on the ground. The protagonist, however, is ready to face the next opponent, but none of the others dare to confront him. So Tiny asks if that's all they've got. Desperate, Edmund goes to Rufus, telling him to get up right now and protect them. Tiny says he can try if he's capable, but he won't let this situation slide. Soon, the two collapse in fear, staying on the ground. Seeing this, the protagonist calls them a pair of cowards. Then, he turns to the others, asking if they want to fight too. The terrified expressions on their faces answer the question. Shortly after, Vivian arrives, worried about Tiny, but upon entering the house, she is faced with something surprising, because the boy had already dealt with all the bullies. Not only that, but she also sees Edmund lying in an embarrassing position, and Tiny wasn't in danger at all. On the contrary, he, in his calm demeanor, asks why she's there. Vivian replies that she's under the princess's orders because she's worried. Then, Tiny hands her a book of bribes, claiming these guys were involved in human trafficking. And with that, he believes that idiot won't be able to deceive anyone else. This makes Vivian wonder what kind of life this boy has had until now. The next day, because of this incident, Edmund was expelled from the duchy. The princess says it seems he had worked with these human trafficking organizations for a long time, and because of this, the Duke's reputation was also severely damaged. She also says that, from now on, relationships will probably become a bit more difficult. Vivian apologizes, but the princess asks if she thinks she did something wrong. But the one who answers is the protagonist, saying that nothing wrong was done. This makes the princess sigh in relief, claiming afterward that she already knew. She states that merits and demerits must be assigned fairly, without regard for one's status. That's what her father always says. Vivian then asks why she's looking at her like that. The princess says she should have at least broken one of Edmund's arms before he passed out. He ended up escaping everything without any punishment. Hearing this makes Tiny think that these two have a very good relationship. The youngest daughter of the famous Sword Emperor and the Genius Knight, a unique combination where, at times, they seem like sisters, and at other times they seem like mother and daughter. After the situation with Khloe changed, they are always together. Tiny thinks it's interesting that someone younger than Khloe acts like an older sister, or even a mother. Then the princess asks what the boy thinks. The protagonist replies that Edmund had more pride in his aristocratic status than anyone else, and no one will ever forget his sins. Vivian exclaims about the things the protagonist says and asks if he's really a child, but the princess is only interested in playing with the lunar wolf. Afterward, she even comments that the wolf's name is too long and decides to call him just Lunar from now on. Tiny asks if she doesn't blame or distrust him. Khloe responds that she has already heard of the dark-haired boy from Phileas. It said he destroyed the underworld organization and freed all the victims, and since he just did it again, the princess finds it incredible. With this, the protagonist is glad she believed him. However, she tells him to never let it happen again, and says Tiny needs to share such things before acting. 3 days later, they are still traveling, until the carriage comes to a stop. One of the guards says that an elf has asked them to set up camp. So, the princess steps out of the carriage along with the others. The elf introduces herself as Irina, an envoy of the World Tree. After greeting the travelers, she asks if she may join them for a moment. The princess seems pleased with the idea. However, Tiny recognizes the elf as a fifth circle sorceress. Elves, descendants of fairies, are famous for their beauty. Elvenheim, the kingdom of the elves, is located in the far west. For this reason, it has always been difficult to see elves in the Aslan Empire, which is at the center of the continent. Even so, most of the empire's people are friendly toward them. Elves born with elemental abilities are known for being pure, gentle, and peace-loving. And this elf is a large-scale fifth circle black mage. In turn, the princess asks if Irina is crossing the Valencia duchy to reach the kingdom of Werevist in the north. Irina imagines that it might be inconvenient for the people of the Aslan Empire, since the empire has been in conflict with the kingdom of Werevist for some time. But the princess says that's not the case and states it's just a long journey. The elf says that's exactly the point, as her goal is to travel the world and hear new stories. Khloe mentions that she has heard about this and asks if Irina is undergoing elven training for the elite elf knights. The elf replies that yes, that's exactly it. However, something piques her curiosity. Irina asks if the princess is the owner of the spirit wolf in her arms. She responds that it's a good guess, but says the spirit belongs to the boy, pointing at the protagonist. Irina says she has heard that there are very few humans with elemental powers. Tiny thinks he already knows everything, and never imagined that this person was someone of high rank. Soon, he says he is impressed, as it's the first time he's seen an elf up close. But it's all an act on his part, because the protagonist believes he can't fight her now and will have to wait. However, his performance convinces Vivian and the princess, and he thinks it doesn't suit his demeanor, but he has to keep up the act. Fortunately for him, the elf doesn't know the lunar wolf's abilities, as only the owner knows all of the spirit's capabilities. He also wonders how the elf manages to hide such a high level of magic. Irina, in turn, says that since they're talking, they could do a demonstration of magic. Tiny wasn't expecting her to showcase her power outdoors. This reminds the protagonist of his past, where a friend named Argun warned him to differentiate elven powers. Either way, he observes that there are 12 level 3 specialists in total, and 1 level 4 warrior. The stages of a mage's circles and a mana user's levels can be considered equivalent. So, to defeat someone 1 level higher, at least 5 people 1 level lower would be needed. In other words, if Tiny, at level 2, wants to defeat someone from the 5th circle, which is above level 3, he would need at least 100 copies of himself. A single attack from the elf would be enough to defeat him. Thus, the protagonist considers preparing a surprise strike and just needs to wait for a good opportunity, since they have a secret card on their side, the lunar wolf. Speaking of which, the wolf jumps from Khloe's lap and goes to Vivian. Seeing this, Irina says he's very cute and that she would also like to hold him for a moment. Then she asks the protagonist if she can, and he responds that she can. He says he won't deny this request and hands over the wolf. But what happens next surprises everyone. The wolf transforms into its strongest form, and the protagonist takes advantage of the moment to attack. The elf definitely wasn't expecting this. Not only that, but Vivian also attacked her with her sword. Irina ended up using her magic, revealing to everyone that she is a dark mage. After being exposed in front of everyone, the princess thinks it was good to have Tiny's company. Since the protagonist can synchronize with the wolf, he was able to warn the princess that the elf was a dark mage. He also said that Vivian could help. At that moment, Khloe was a bit shocked, but she knew she had to maintain her composure. The protagonist knew this could become an international issue, but he said he hoped the princess would understand. He also explained that, at the rear of Filias, if they didn't launch a surprise attack at that moment, they would be in danger, and he would risk his life to deal with it. After making the princess aware of his plan, the wolf leaped into Vivian's arms. This allowed the protagonist to alert her as well. With that, the two managed to coordinate their attacks, catching the ill-intentioned elf off guard. However, this didn't last long, as the elf managed to escape soon after. From above, she summoned a magical shield. Vivian shouted for her soldiers to attack together, and they did so in unison. The protagonist wasn't left out, as he attacked along with the others. But, as expected, the elf was very strong, and he couldn't penetrate the force field. After that, one of the guards also attacked. However, this only made the elf angrier. She used her magic to push them away. Irina, furious at being discovered, demanded to know how they figured it out. Tiny replied that it wasn't hard to tell since he smelled the stench of her dark magic. The boy's audacity provoked Irina's deepest hatred. This made her even stronger, even surprising Tiny. Irina used her magic to cause an explosion, creating a cloud of magical smoke. Everyone was about to be hit, including the protagonist, who was very close. But he managed to summon a magical force field to protect himself. Even so, the impact was so strong that he was thrown far away. After getting up from the ground, he thought this was the first time he had to use this ability in his current life, and he was barely missed by the attack. Meanwhile, Vivian said that the elf's shield was weakened and they should seize the opportunity to attack. Irina kept attacking, shouting for everyone to get out of her way. Tiny took the moment to mount the lunar wolf and charge toward the opponent. However, once again, he couldn't break through her shield. Even so, he caught the elf's attention. Distracted, she didn't notice the others approaching, but at the last second, she managed to dodge their attack, saying that if this ends with just one death, it will be completely useless. She also declared that, now that things had reached this point, she would kill everyone. Her words, however, didn't frighten the heroes, who used the moment to attack again. This infuriated the elf even more. Tiny approached from above and tried to strike her. He managed to land a blow, but it only hit her shield. However, the force of his attack was so strong that it knocked the elf to the ground. This caused her force field to start cracking. Irina didn't like this at all, but Tiny said there's more where that came from. In turn, the elf declared she would take all of them with her. She then used an area of effect spell, affecting everyone around her, including the princess, who, seeing the approaching danger, was startled. But Vivian stepped in, stopping Khloe from being hit. Then she told her men to hold on a little longer. However, looking up, she saw something surprising. It was the protagonist moving like a meteor. Tiny, for his part, thought it was perfect that the flames were completely blocked. And thanks to his improved vision, the iron armor is much better and more useful than in his past life. Now he thinks he must attack with full force to finally defeat the enemy. After striking the elf's force field again, he managed, through the impact, to cause another magical explosion. The impact threw Vivian far away, and Tiny too, though he was saved by the wolf. Even so, he got hurt, but it could have been much worse. His effort, however, wasn't in vain, as Tiny succeeded in destroying the elf's magical shield. Having succeeded, he mounts the wolf again, and charges forward, telling the others to attack as well. Vivian stands up and acts according to the plan. Frustrated and angry, Irina asks how they dare, calling them filthy humans and pushing them back with magic. Vivian notices that the elf still has considerable power, but looking at the protagonist, she sees that it hasn't stopped him from attacking. The protagonist continues advancing toward the opponent, and as he gets close enough, he launches another attack on her. Then Vivian tells the guards they need to finish this quickly. Realizing she's at a disadvantage, the elf retreats, and the protagonist notices she's fleeing. He immediately tells everyone to stop her by attacking. But the elf wasn't fleeing. Instead, she gained enough height to unleash her most powerful attack yet. Tiny realizes she's the last follower of the demon, but sacrificing her body to amplify her powers is absurd to him. Even so, Irina performs the fiery offering, aiming to burn everything below. After that, the black magic flames engulf the area, hitting several royal guards. The protagonist manages to escape with his wolf, and notices that the warriors are already at their limit, concluding they need greater power to end this fight. So he says they must have bought enough time, and states that it's Khloe's turn to act. The princess then begins to manifest her power. She uses her ability called Shine, the divine power channeled through penance and blessings. Those who attain priesthood through penance, only after being baptized and learning about divine power, receive the anti-demon power. However, there have been people born with this power, a saint and a warrior said to be sent by God in difficult times, or a being rarely born, someone not born into priesthood, a person called a cleric. Khloe is one of these people, and by using her power to combat black magic, she surprises even her bodyguards. The protagonist knows she kept this ability hidden from everyone around her out of fear of being summoned by the priests. Khloe is the most powerful cleric Tiny has ever seen. He even thought the princess was still weak. But this is already enough. Not even the elf expected this. She hadn't prepared a defense for it, and was soon pulverized by the princess's light magic, because Khloe poured all her strength into this attack. Lying on the ground, Irina can't believe this happened, especially because she can't believe she would need help from beings she considers inferior. However, tired of hearing her talk, the protagonist strikes the elf on the head. Then he says everyone is still in shock, so he'll finish the job. But the princess stops him, saying the elf cannot die yet. Tiny asks why not, and Khloe says the elf must be interrogated, because even as a cleric, the princess didn't sense the elf's dark magic and needs to understand why. Khloe wants to heal the elf with her magic, and Tiny says if she wants to test it, he recommends she go ahead. Seeing the elf's body, Tiny says she had a death befitting a black mage. On the other hand, the guards find it incredible that the princess is a cleric. Khloe says that, in the end, her secret was revealed, and she feels like she's lost a lot. Then she asks if he knew her secret since he was the only one who didn't seem surprised when she used her abilities. The protagonist responds that he did, and the princess wonders how since this secret is kept even within her family. Tiny says he can't explain it now, but he will at some point. Khloe is satisfied with this answer and doesn't question him further, which surprises the protagonist. He also remembers the mage who was after him, admitting that he's already gotten into too many problems. He also says the princess was in danger because of him and claims it's the noble's duty to eliminate all demonic threats. But Khloe says that if she had died, it would have been due to her own lack of power, and she sees no reason to be angry with Tiny. This only makes the protagonist think that the princess is still the same as she was in his past life. After that, the princess notices that the boy was worried about her and finds it endearing. Vivian notices this and asks if the protagonist hates being called a child. He says no, but in his thoughts, he knows he's older than he looks. However, Vivian says that children at his age hate being called a child. And this shows that the protagonist, like other children, has a normal side. Tiny insists that this has nothing to do with anything. Khloe feels her obligations as a princess, thinking she must report what happened to her father as soon as possible. She concludes that she will send a report as soon as they reach the nearest city. Sometime later, they arrive at the main gate of the city of Tybin. Seeing the reception, the protagonist thinks to himself that he knew the Sword Emperor takes good care of his daughter, but this is a bit much. Not only does he think this, but Khloe also does, blushing with embarrassment. The people around are also impressed, as a fleet of blue-winged knights presents itself to welcome the princess. Seeing this, Tiny thinks the Valencia elite is quite over the top. All these knights are at least specialists, and belong to the most powerful group in the empire. After this, Garen Clemen, vice-captain of the Blue-Winged Knights, leading a force of 103 knights, introduces himself to the princess with greetings. The princess says he and the other knights have done a great job and tells them to rise. Garen expresses his happiness to see that the princess is safe and says that His Excellency was very worried. Khloe, however, says she is sure she wrote in her report that she was safe, claiming that it's a bit of an exaggeration for them to appear here. Garen asks if she didn't face an attack by a dark mage and says that if there weren't an emergency at the moment, her father would have come to meet her personally. The princess asks what emergency this is. The vice captain explains that about a month and a half ago, the Tempest family's relics suddenly disappeared, something that shocks Khloe. Tiny also becomes concerned about this. He asks if this relic is an artifact, but Khloe isn't sure. This grabs the protagonist's attention even more. She explains that this is a secret only passed down to the head of the family. She adds that no one else knows, and she can only suppose it might be a powerful artifact. Then Tiny says he knows why the relic disappeared. Everyone present is shocked to hear this, but the protagonist simply asks to meet His Excellency, saying he will tell them everything he knows. After that, the Blue Wing Knights escort the princess and her group back home. Meanwhile, the vice captain reflects on what the protagonist said, and asks one of the princess's personal guards about him. The guard says the boy's name is Tiny and claims he's an incredible boy, even saying he captured the dark mage. He also mentions that he heard the protagonist is almost at the expert level, which doesn't match his age, surprising the captain, because he knows that even the 7 knights didn't reach that level at such a young age, making the boy seem like a genius or a monster. Garen Clement even thinks it would have been amazing if this boy had been born into his family, but then he remembers something, and says he recalls who brought the letter from Phileas. He states that the name is uncommon, and it must be him. In the carriage, the princess is mesmerized by the scenery, seeing a field of flowers outside. Seeing this, Tiny asks if she likes lilacs. Khloe responds that she does, adding that her father and her late mother also loved them, and they even named her after the flower, to which the protagonist says it suits her. Vivian comments that the love between the Duke and the lady was very famous, and she's heard that she was the only woman the Duke ever loved. However, Tiny remembers that before he died, Khloe's father said he actually didn't like that flower very much and asked Tiny not to forget it. Now, the protagonist knows that, without a doubt, the Sword Emperor would want to keep this a secret. He also knows that the Emperor likely won't remember his past life, but the Emperor told the protagonist to find him immediately, so there must be a way. Tiny thinks he must meet the Sword Emperor to define his path and find a way to become a great knight. For the protagonist, his level is the priority right now. If he doesn't reach at least commander level, it won't help him at all, because in this life, he wants to destroy those who stood in his way in the past. At the mansion of the Duke of Valencia, one of the largest in the Aslan Empire, the guards celebrate their return home. The princess asks the protagonist if he has been to Valencia before. Tiny responds that this is his first time. Khloe doesn't quite understand what he means, but then both are startled, because the princess's father shouts with joy upon seeing her again. Right away, the protagonist recognizes him. However, he didn't expect to see such a formidable warrior acting like a doting father. The old man doesn't care about that, as he's just happy to see his daughter. On the other hand, Khloe is dying of embarrassment. When she sees her father running toward her for a hug, she dodges. Her father asks why she's doing that, and she says everyone is watching, and he should have a little pride. Crying, he asks what's wrong with a father worrying about his daughter, but Khloe says it's no use making that face, and he should apologize to the knights who had to suffer so much for nothing. So he does, saying they did an excellent job and that, thanks to them, his daughter is safe. Then he expresses his gratitude as a father, above being the Duke of Valencia. After that, he says a banquet has been prepared for them, and tells everyone to enjoy it. The Duke then asks who the boy accompanying his daughter is. Tiny realizes the old man didn't recognize him. Khloe says she already told him about the boy, mentioning that the protagonist will testify about the black mage. Her father says he's been very stressed lately and didn't remember that. But straight away, Tiny tells the Duke that he can say where Tempest is. His direct statement surprises everyone, including the princess, who definitely didn't expect this. Even the Duke is startled, calling him a cheeky boy. Quickly, the protagonist feels something strange, as he's under the effect of soul pressure, but he thinks the Sword Emperor still has much to learn before finally reaching the level of previous proficiency. Among the 7 knights, Astaina has the highest proficiency, and Jarek is another who could have achieved that level. In his thoughts, the protagonist concludes he can suppress all of this with the power he accumulated in his previous life. After that, he asks the Duke if they can talk about this right there, outside. Such boldness shocks the Duke, but the princess tells her father that the protagonist is still just a child and doesn't know what he's saying. However, her father replies that someone who knows nothing wouldn't act like this, and states that he needs to speak with this boy. Later, in a more appropriate place, the Duke wants to know more about what the protagonist mentioned. Tiny says he has a hunch about where Tempest might be. The Duke says he's curious about this hunch. Tempest is one of the few ancient words the protagonist knows. It means time or opportunity. He says that if this artifact has been missing for a month, perhaps its power is time reversal. Hearing this piques the Duke's curiosity even more. The protagonist says it all began with a catastrophe that would only occur 20 years later. He then tells his entire story, and the Duke listens intently. After hearing it, he says the story is very well constructed, believing it's unlikely to have been invented by a child, since the boy even knows the names of the World Tree's guardians, the first dwarven hammer, and the orc warrior. Tiny claims they were colleagues for a year. This leaves the Duke puzzled, as he states those sworn enemies are always at odds. He also says that only one person can be sent to the past, and that after sacrificing the life of a very powerful human, their descendants must use it with caution. These words are passed down along with the family relic, but honestly, the Duke didn't think it was true. However, the circumstances the boy described seem real, but he admits it's difficult to trust his judgment. So he asks if his future self really trusted the protagonist's talents and sent him back in time. The Duke says that if it had been him who returned, he would have used his experiences from the previous life and his status. Thus, he'd be ready to organize humanity's power to face the Demon King's army. Despite that, he's still doubtful about one thing. Why didn't he return instead of the protagonist? The Duke becomes indignant that it was the boy who returned in time, not him, and asks why this happened. Tiny says only the Duke's future self can answer, as before sending him back, the Duke said something about saving his talent. That's when the protagonist realized the Duke had gone mad. The Duke understands and imagines that his future self didn't know where he was sending the protagonist. Tiny is surprised to have been sent back by someone who didn't know where he would end up. Since he had never used the item, the Duke says he couldn't know, but instead, he simply conveys these words. He says the protagonist should return to where his soul was most troubled. Looking at Tiny's current state, the Duke believes the boy has returned to the moment when he found his determination, and so his future self must have foreseen this as well. Now the protagonist understands the reason he returned to the day his sister died. After this, the Duke asks if he thinks his future self made any mistake. Tiny replies that he doesn't believe so. He states that the Sword Emperor isn't to blame, and he's already happy that he can see his sister once again. Then the Duke says they have one more thing to confirm. He mentions that if his future self told the protagonist to find him, there must be some form of confirmation prepared. The protagonist recalls that the Emperor said his daughter's baptismal name is Lilac. She received this name because it was his wife's favorite flower, but the Duke says that information is already well known. However, Tiny reveals that, in truth, he doesn't like that flower very much. That would be the confirmation his future self passed on. Upon hearing this, the Duke lets out a loud laugh. He says that's absolutely something he would say, remarking that telling the person he sent back words he could never say to anyone else is exactly like him, since he'd never want anyone to know about it. Now he knows it's all true and isn't sure whether to laugh or cry about it. The Duke realizes that only this would make the disappearance of the relic make sense, as it was always in his room, in his hands. Tiny feels relieved that the Duke believed his story. However, the Duke then says there's still one thing to verify. He orders that Knight Royer be summoned. Afterward, Tiny asks what he's doing. The Duke explains that while he believes in Tiny's regression, he's not sure he can fully trust him, because the protagonist claimed to be Tiny, one of the 10 Knights of the future, and he wants the boy to prove it's true, confirming that his abilities were recognized by his future self. Later, outside the palace, Tiny starts to think it's a bit unfair since the Emperor told him to seek him out, but now his current self wants to test his abilities. So the protagonist decides to use this chance to tease the Duke and asks if he's never wondered what his future might look like. The Duke replies that he has, many times. Tiny then asks if he wouldn't like to know a bit about the duchy's future, but the Duke responds that he doesn't need to know. He states that everything he's curious about involves the foreboding of a disaster, and tells the protagonist never to say otherwise, either to him nor to others, because people evolve through their mistakes and failures. The Duke asserts that he is proud to have taught his children the right way, ensuring they wouldn't crumble in moments of frustration, and he doesn't want the protagonist to disrupt his children's opportunities to grow. Even so, Tiny insists that he knows a little about the princess's situation, but he asks how someone like him, who struggled so much because of his body, could get close to the Duke's family. The Duke is taken aback by this, and asks if the protagonist truly has no idea what might happen in the future. Tiny replies that he only knows the aristocracy turned into chaos. With this, the Duke asks if that's all he knows. Tiny responds by asking what else he wants to know. Referring to Tiny, the Duke says he is the only allied force from the future and asks if he doesn't think the Duke needs to know what happened in the meantime. But the boy's lack of information drives him mad, so the Duke tugs on Tiny's ear, telling him he'd better remember quickly, or he'll be beaten to death. He also says the pain in his ear will serve as motivation. Later that night, in another location, the Duke, reading a document, wonders why it remains so empty. He also discovers that there are more than 10 disasters and wonders what they are and why the protagonist is so careless. Except for a few, Tiny learned about most disasters through rumors or from some of his comrades. In a serious tone, the Duke asks if he has any useful information. This makes Tiny think he needs to grow quickly, at least before they were on equal footing. The Duke says the only useful information the boy has is about a holy warrior who is mentioned in the oracle. The name would be Cromwell, and he was 20 years old, so the Duke says he needs to find him to train him. However, regarding this last piece of information, Tiny highlights an important detail, that the warrior was 20 years old in the future. But now, he hasn't even been born yet. The Duke becomes desperate, asking why the protagonist is doing this to him, and wondering if it's his future self's fault, or if he should simply kill this boy who isn't helping him at all. But then, his servant appears, saying that he has already summoned Royd. The Duke, however, instructs him to bring Drexler instead of Royd and to tell him that there's someone deserving of punishment. After this, Drexler Ainen arrives. He is the vice captain of the Blue Wing Knights, a level 5 superior rank. Drexler is extremely excited to have been summoned by the Lord. The Duke greets him formally, and says he needs him to test the boy to see if he's worthy of his trust. This surprises Drexler, as he wasn't expecting to have to fight a child. He wonders why his lord called a vice captain for such a trivial matter and questions whether he did something wrong to be demoted. In his mind, he imagines it would be very difficult to maintain the mansion without the vice captain, but the Duke calls him back, telling him not to get lost in his useless imagination. He also says this is a very important matter, so Drexler should fight the boy carefully. Drexler takes a good look at the protagonist, and notices something surprising. The boy is at level 2, even before becoming a specialist. The boy seems to be about 10 years old, so Drexler wonders how that's possible. In turn, Tiny asks Drexler to introduce the craftsman who made his weapon. He says it would be better if the hammer were bigger, and even gives some tips about it. But the Duke tells him to focus, as failing the test would mean not fulfilling the promise. The Duke also tells Drexler not to hold back, encouraging him to fight with all his might. Afterward, he tells the protagonist that he promised to help him, and he will decide whether to keep that promise based on the result of this fight. Tiny asks if the outcome depends on who wins. However, the Duke responds that he doesn't think it will go that far. He also says that if Tiny manages to land a single hit on the vice captain, he will pretend the boy won the duel. That's enough to get Tiny excited. Drexler then prepares his weapon, and the protagonist does the same. The two face each other, making the Duke realize that the boy has a unique way of handling mana, because he created a very clear vision, undoubtedly marking him as a genius. But he suspects that's not all, because if he had the experiences of the future, he himself could become a specialist far beyond common limits. Even so, it was this child who returned in time, and the Duke imagines there must be some reason beyond his talents to warrant such attention in the future. Then, he orders the two to fight with all their strength. In turn, Tiny summons his spirit wolf, saying that if his opponent doesn't attack, he will. Mounted on the wolf, the protagonist charges forward. Drexler is impressed that the boy has a spirit, but claims it doesn't matter, because he shows no fear in this situation. However, as he attacks, the protagonist dodges, something Drexler wasn't expecting. Tiny takes advantage of the chance, and tries to land a hit on his opponent. He manages to strike a blow on Drexler's armor. However, it doesn't leave a scratch, which makes him wonder if Drexler specializes in both attack and defense. On the other side, Drexler says he's having fun. He also says he'll take it easy, so the boy doesn't end up dying. With his hammer, he attacks but ends up hitting the ground. Tiny then focuses, and says he will compete using speed. Drexler doesn't just stand still. He finds the protagonist quite bold, and with a ground strike, he collapses the columns the boy was using to move through the heights. Tiny then realizes not just that, but Drexler has advanced and narrowly missed him, as he managed to jump at the last moment. The protagonist is surprised to see Drexler wielding a hammer larger than a sword with a single hand, making it seem as though shields are also used in pairs. This means he's focused on defense. Drexler asks how long the protagonist plans to keep running. Meanwhile, Tiny continues evading from above, making Drexler realize he's very good at dodging. From outside the arena, the Duke observes, thinking he can read all of Drexler's movements. The vice captain thought he would only face a 10-year-old boy, but it seems that Tiny's past life's experiences still remain with him. To the Duke, Tiny is certainly impressive, but he believes it's not enough and wants to see everything the boy has to offer. So he asks Drexler how long he plans to drag this out. This angers the vice captain even more, and it gives him the motivation he needed. Soon, with all his strength, he attacks the protagonist with his strongest skill. The skill, which the Duke himself recognizes as a soul weapon, surprises him. He thinks it was unnecessary and knows he must stop him. Tiny, in turn, doesn't seem worried, because he faces the opponent head-on, making the Duke think the boy must be crazy. The clash between the two ends in a huge explosion in the air. With the impact of the explosion, the protagonist falls at great speed. The Duke then calls him an idiot, and Drexler apologizes for the excessive force. The Duke says he wanted to see the protagonist's talent, not his courage. But with a smile on his face, Tiny says he won. The Duke doesn't quite understand what he's saying. However, when he looks at Drexler, he notices a wound on his face. When the protagonist advanced in the fight, before being hit by his opponent, he threw his weapon toward him, because he managed to get close enough. So, at that moment, Drexler was struck. That's why Tiny jumped. And now that he understands this, the Duke says the boy could have died and shouldn't do something so reckless just to win. Tiny insists that he didn't die and that he won, but the Duke asks if he was this reckless in his past life. The protagonist confirms that he was, because, according to him, if he didn't act that way, life would become a dark alley with nothing to offer. After all, he asks if this isn't just a game where they have to win no matter what, stating that's how he's lived until now. Then he asks what the Duke thought, and if he managed to prove anything. The Duke says he would never do something like that, and imagines that, perhaps in his past life, he must have thought it was worth attempting something so reckless. Then he says he will keep his promise, and give the protagonist what he needs most now. Tiny tries to thank him for his kindness, but then, he loses his strength, and collapses on the arena floor. After some time, he wakes up, and upon seeing the Duke, he asks where he is. The Duke says he recovered faster than expected and mentions they have much to discuss. Tiny asks how much time has passed, and the Duke replies that it's been about half a day. The protagonist then asks if he called any priest. But just then, the princess appears, saying she just finished recovering and asks where he wants her to take the boy who just woke up. She also asks if he didn't intend to hurt him again. However, she hears from her father that the boy hurt himself, and he wouldn't hurt his daughter's benefactor. The protagonist is surprised to be called that since he thought it was the opposite until now. Khloe says he was between life and death, but Tiny simply smiles, and says that, as the Duke mentioned, he was too greedy. He apologizes for the trouble. The princess tells him he should act more like a child. However, the Duke approaches him closely, saying that it seems that, even as a child, Tiny recognizes beauty, and warns him not to dare touch his daughter. Tiny deflects, saying he's just embarrassed to be called the princess's benefactor, stating that this never happened originally, and becoming a benefactor right after capturing a dark mage was something he didn't expect. The Duke then understands this didn't happen in his past life. The princess then asks what they're talking about, and her father evades, saying that if it were important, he would certainly tell her. He also says she should focus on her coming-of-age ceremony, as the preparations are almost complete, and he's sure she'll enjoy it. The princess, however, seems a little upset, and walks away with a sad look. Tiny seems to have noticed this but lets her go. Afterward, alone, the Duke says he forgot to give an important piece of advice and tells Tiny that the fact he returned to this moment must remain a secret between them. The protagonist says he doesn't intend to tell anyone, and the Duke says this must not reach other ears, especially priests in particular, because the flow of space-time is the axis of destiny organized by the Creator, a power even the goddess who governs all things cannot touch. A mere human going against this is akin to blasphemy. That's why your family has kept the existence of Tempest a secret. Tiny asks if the goddess isn't the same as the Creator. The Duke replies that he shouldn't know because this information was erased from the temple's scriptures. However, something that the true scriptures say has been passed down among the oldest families. For now, the Duke wants to leave things as they are. He says that the 10 knights the protagonist mentioned must be the only ones aware of this information. Tiny agrees, saying he has no intention of leaving the 10 knights alone. He adds that this will make him stronger than before, and that he knows all the strategies of the future. The Duke says that's perfect, and asks what abilities he used in the future. Before answering, Tiny asks if the Duke will turn him in. This catches the Duke by surprise. The protagonist says he should be more aware of what he promised to give, claiming that he's becoming old and senile. This leaves the Duke super irritated, and he smacks the boy on the head. Tiny then asks why he did that. The Duke takes him back to the arena, saying he must start educating him. Tiny asks if he knows his real age, to which the Duke responds that it only makes the problem worse. But since he promised, he'll give the protagonist what he wants. And he also wants to tell him about some visions dedicated to the Duke of Valencia. He then asks if the boy has ever heard of a force called gravity. After some time, the protagonist starts to doze off, and he falls asleep during the explanation. The Duke wakes him up with another smack, saying they haven't even started yet, and he's already asleep. Tiny tells him to stop hitting him, so the Duke demands he pay attention and explains that his family's vision is divided into 4 fundamental parts. Mana techniques, a sword style that combines defense and attack, methods to acquire attributes in 3 steps, and a method to gain aura traits in 7 stages. The protagonist then says it makes sense for a Valencia to be this skilled. With that, the Duke boasts. So, since the protagonist said he uses an offensive weapon, The Duke says the boy doesn't need attack sword training. Tiny says his great hammer is better than any sword. But there's something else he wants. That ridiculously powerful defense he saw the Emperor use, calling it the perfect lesson. The Duke then explains that among the parts of Valencia's vision, there are differences, and that's the method of acquiring aura traits. The protagonist doesn't quite understand, but the Duke says that's what he's teaching him now, how to acquire attributes. Tiny feels disappointed because he wanted to learn more about defense. However, the Duke knows what he's doing. Elsewhere, far from there, a meeting of hooded figures takes place, and one of them says Elaine is dead. He adds that she was the blade meant to pierce the heart of Elvenheim, and losing such an important resource so easily is something they can't accept. But he states that the culprit is a child who believes himself to be a descendant of the Morse family. Then he tells the others to gather information about this child, but they must ensure the Empire knows nothing. The others agree with this decision. Before concluding, the leader says they must remember that, for now, Curran's mission is the most important. Back to the protagonist, he's all battered but has learned that, to acquire attributes, he first needs certain traits. Next, he says he already possesses all the attributes convenient for him, and asks if the third stage will cause an explosion like in his previous life. The Duke replies that he already checked when his body collapsed after that fight, and he states that, even with a child's body, Tiny was heavier than most knights. Therefore, his body is shaped by the vision. Tiny isn't sure about that, but the Duke tells him to think carefully and asks if he didn't use armor in his previous life. With that, the protagonist remembers he did use very heavy armor. The Duke then says that the heavier the body, the heavier the armor. In other words, the greater the energy absorbed, the slower the movements, and he asks if Tiny knows why. Then he states that it's because of something some sorcerers call gravity. If he masters this attribute, the heavier his body becomes, and the more energy his body holds, the faster and stronger he will become. The Duke asks if the boy is interested now. He then states that this is an ability no ordinary expert could compare to, as there is a force between objects. Hearing this makes the protagonist increasingly curious. However, he can't fully focus on the Duke's words. This irritates the old man even more. He tries to explain again, but the protagonist asks why the ground would attract anything, finding the Duke's explanation nonsensical. The boy's ignorance makes the Duke impatient and frustrated, but he doesn't give up and asks why the boy thinks things in high places fall. Tiny replies that it has always been that way. Already irritated, the Duke says it happens because of gravity, but the protagonist shows no interest in learning about it. This makes the Duke ask why he doesn't try a little harder to understand. Tiny asks why it has to be so complicated, claiming that if he doesn't understand then it's fine as it is. This lack of respect ignites the old man's full fury, calling the protagonist a damn brat, and preparing to crush him. He then takes the boy to the top of a tower, and holds him by the edge, by his shirt alone, causing the protagonist to panic. The Duke says he will learn through practice. Not only that, but he also uses ice mana to increase the boy's weight. Then, he asks again why someone who climbed so high would have no choice but to fall. Desperate, the protagonist answers, gravity, but he says it without understanding what it truly means. For this reason, the Duke lets him go, allowing him to fall, telling the boy to feel gravity firsthand. As he falls, the protagonist thinks the Duke is insane, but he realizes nothing will stop him from hitting the ground, because if he continues falling like this, he will certainly die. So he decides to try something, and calls his lunar wolf. The wolf appears on the ground, slightly disoriented, and sees that Tiny is about to fall straight onto him. The protagonist, somewhat embarrassed, apologizes to the wolf for what's about to happen. Then, he falls onto the animal. With this, his fall is cushioned, and he manages to survive. But shortly after, the Duke appears, asking if he felt the greatness of gravity. Tiny replies that he felt it in every part of his being. This satisfies the Duke, who states that this was a height from which he wouldn't die if he fell. He then asks if the boy understands what gravity is now. Tiny, however, doesn't seem to have understood, so the Duke says they should try several more times until he gets it, claiming that practice is the best way. However, the protagonist dislikes being thrown off again, saying it would be better to learn just with words. After falling several times from the tower, he wakes up in a bed, being healed with magic. Khloe is happy he has finally woken up, saying it's amazing that he has already become an expert, something Tiny wasn't even aware of himself. He remembers all the times he fell, and wonders if that's even possible. Khloe says that even though he's happy to be her father's disciple, she asks what kind of training it was. Not even the protagonist knows how to answer that. Even so, the princess says it's amazing he became an expert, and she's happy that a genius has appeared in Blue Wing. Tiny, however, asks if it's okay for her to be there. He states that she should be preparing for her coming-of-age ceremony, as her father mentioned. The princess becomes a little flustered, and says there's nothing to prepare. The only thing she needs to do is learn etiquette. Tiny becomes a bit thoughtful, but says she'll do well. Khloe asks what he's talking about, and he replies that he means the ceremony. Then, the princess tells him to stop joking, stating that she knows she'll do well because that's the day she'll be the star. She then asks if she looks nervous. Tiny responds that everyone close to her can see it. In any case, Khloe says it's fine because Tiny is part of the family now. This surprises the protagonist. However, Khloe says he's her father's disciple, so they're part of the same family, and even tells Tiny he can call her sister from now on. The protagonist definitely wasn't expecting that. Khloe asks what kind of reaction that is, claiming it's a great honor since she's the Duke's daughter. And since they're now family, she asks if the protagonist can keep a secret. He replies that it's not a problem. But thinking it over, the princess mentions that Lord Drexler is looking for Tiny, something he didn't know. After that, he heads back to the arena. This time, many people are watching him, because Drexler says he heard the protagonist has become a specialist. Tiny says yes but doesn't understand why he was summoned. He realizes this doesn't seem like something ordinary, due to some people watching him closely. Drexler says he doesn't need to worry, and asks the boy what he thinks about a rematch. Seeing that Drexler dropped his weapon, the protagonist wonders if it's because of what happened in their last fight. Drexler says it's not typical for knights to lose their patience with children. Then he says they'll fight now to help him get used to his new level. Tiny says that if that's the case, he won't refuse the invitation, and immediately goes on the attack, striking his opponent's shield. Even with the shield, Drexler feels the blow, and wonders if this is really the same boy he fought a week ago. Again, the protagonist prepares to attack. Then he puts some distance between himself and his opponent, and charges again. But this time, he's not unarmed like his opponent, with his weapon charged with energy. Tiny prepares to strike him. Drexler doesn't stay idle and charges his punch, thinking that even a light touch could cause significant injury. However, both end up colliding their attacks, causing an explosion and throwing them far from each other. Drexler wonders why the boy's attacks feel heavier. Either way, he regains his composure and withstands the protagonist's consecutive attacks. Meanwhile, he observes the boy, noticing that he's even faster than last time. With his club, Tiny attacks, and doesn't hold back on the energy in his strikes. Even those watching from a distance notice how heavy his club is. Not only that, but they see that the protagonist can handle it with remarkable speed. Drexler gives up fighting unarmed and says the protagonist doesn't need to hold back on him. Tiny then says he'll do just that. The opponent charges toward him, but Tiny, having been hit by those attacks a few times, knows how they work. His weapon is lighter than usual, even when swung, and when it hits the target, it's much heavier than it seems. Drexler feels the pressure of the strike, then pushes the protagonist away from him. Tiny thinks that after manipulating the senses of the mana body, it's just a matter of applying it in the fight. While his opponent realizes what's coming, the protagonist executes the level 1 combat method, nicknamed by him as Lightning Hammer. When it strikes Drexler's shield, the impact causes a massive explosion. From the outside, some wonder if this is the strength of a specialist. After that, Drexler says they don't need to fight anymore. Tiny thanks him for the help. Drexler claims he held back on him. However, Tiny also says he didn't show everything he knows. This surprises the vice captain. The protagonist reminds him that he's an elementalist, and by summoning his wolf, he makes Drexler realize he didn't even use it. Then the vice captain says the protagonist passed the test and welcomes him to the Blue Wing. However, Tiny says his wish isn't to join the knights and asks if the Duke didn't inform him of the situation. Drexler didn't expect to hear that, and is surprised the boy doesn't want to be a knight. Later, in the Duke's office, he tells the protagonist that he forgot to inform the Blue Wing, and says that if the protagonist plans to travel the continent, it's better not to belong to any family. Either way, he says he did an excellent job, and exceeded his expectations, but Tiny knows what he had to go through and doesn't like it at all. In any case, the Duke says they're almost ready to face the first catastrophe. Tiny asks what's missing. The Duke replies that they still need to create a Warhammer artifact for the protagonist to use. An artifact infused with nearly permanent magical power. Its value can vary greatly, but it would take at least a few years' salary of a knight to buy something like that. Then the protagonist asks if it wouldn't take too long to produce one. The Duke replies that one has been in progress for a few months. It was a secret because it was originally meant to be a gift for Drexler's loyalty and service. After that, the protagonist goes to Valencia's best forge, called Rendel's Hammer. He then requests an adjustment, but Rendel, the dwarf craftsman, finds it odd that a boy would ask for something like that. He states that he would rather cancel the contract and pay the penalty than have his work treated as if it were a children's toy. The protagonist knows that the dwarven artisans want the weapon to find its rightful owner, even if it means taking a loss. So he knows he needs to prove his worth. He quickly asks if the dwarf thinks he is better than an average knight. Rendel takes a good look at the boy, and notices that he is an expert, even though he seems very young for it. Then he asks if this is some kind of trick. However, Rendell has a unique characteristic of dwarves, his right eye, which allows him to detect truth and lies based on the emotional waves of words. Thus, he confirms the boy's honesty and agrees to do what the protagonist asks, and tells him to wait. When he returns, he brings the hammer. Tiny asks if it is ready. The dwarf says it's not completely sharpened yet, as it still lacks impact amplification, automatic repair functions, and protective magic. The protagonist asks if it couldn't include offensive magic. The dwarf thought he wanted protection, but Tiny clarifies that's not the case, arguing that a war hammer isn't common, as it's not very popular, and anyone would be foolish to reject a third circle spell. Rendell then says there is, in fact, only one other war hammer, describing it as made of compressed black steel and covered with weight amplification runes. However, he explains that it ended up being too heavy, so he abandoned the project. But Tiny says he really likes the sound of it, and asks about its other specifications. The dwarf explains the other features, and the protagonist becomes eager to see the hammer. Due to his insistence, Rendell takes the boy to the weapon, and upon seeing the hammer, Tiny's eyes light up. However, Rendell says it's not as grand as it looks because the hammer weighs over 100 kilograms. But before he knows it, the boy already has the hammer in his hands. Even realizing the weapon is heavy, Tiny can still wield it. He even strikes the ground with it, alarming the dwarf, as it could have collapsed the house. The dwarf notices that the boy has fallen in love with the hammer. In turn, the protagonist says the hammer is a bit small but resembles the nocturne he used in his previous life. Tiny then asks if the dwarf could help him with the dagger so he can still use it as he grows. Rendell says he doesn't even need to ask. The protagonist then tells him to charge the Duke double but asks what the war hammer is called. Rendell replies that its name is Stamp. Upon seeing the hammer, the Count is surprised that something like this exists, and thinks it's great that Drexler will get his own too. Tiny says it will take about 2 weeks to make the necessary adjustments, and he needs to train in the meantime. He states that he is still far from becoming invincible. Upon hearing this, the Count asks where that idea came from. The protagonist explains that he learned some Eastern languages because of his appearance, and mentions that he's often told he looks like a demon. The Duke says the boy is very amusing and made a good choice. He also tells him to use more of those Eastern languages, as sometimes he comes off as a bit dim. After that, the Duke says that since Tiny has to wait 2 weeks, he will participate in Khloe's coming-of-age ceremony. Tiny asks if he will make that announcement. The Duke says it's about a connection with the imperial family, and asks how Khloe could refuse an engagement with the Crown Prince. As he mentioned before, the Crown Prince died on his wedding day. Thus, the protagonist asks if the Duke will go ahead with it, knowing this. By next summer, all direct members of the imperial family of Aslan will die, marking the second catastrophe. As a result, the Empire, once considered the strongest human nation, will suffer from internal conflicts, and the nation's power will fragment. The princess will become a widow and the sole survivor of the imperial family, earning the title of the heiress princess of misfortune. Now knowing all this, the Duke says the protagonist doesn't need to worry, as he will take care of everything. Tiny says that all he knows is that there were rumors the second prince was responsible, but he also died. He recalls Khloe telling him to call her sister, and begins to worry about her. He states that even her father couldn't figure out what happened in the previous life, as everything was shrouded in uncertainty. The Duke says his daughter is brilliant, being someone whose personality shines brighter than her appearance, yet people still fail to see it. However, the protagonist says that later, the entire world will see it. After all, even if the Duke helped her, it was she who managed to rebuild the ruined empire. Nevertheless, she didn't seem happy. Then the Duke says that, for his daughter and for the entire world, he will choose the best path, claiming that he can prevent all of this from happening precisely because he is Esgard von Valencia. If that's the case, the protagonist states that he will not stop him. Instead, in the end, he will save Khloe his own way. However, jealousy overtakes the Duke, as he claims that the protagonist is too close to his daughter and doesn't seem to have good intentions toward her. The protagonist knows the Duke loses his temper when it comes to his daughter and says he misunderstood him, trying to calm him down. Outside, two men are talking, and one wonders if everyone is there because of the princess's coming-of-age ceremony. The other says that everything is now ready and that he has taken care of everything. Thus, his companion can have fun safely. The big day has arrived. The commander of the Blue Wing Knights tells the Duke that they have received more guests than expected, saying it shows how influential Valencia is. His name is Jenna's Freewell, and he claims they will make this day unforgettable. By the way, he also mentions they've received a guest from Octor. It's the third son, known for being a parasite. The Roctor Duchy is a major power in the Empire and a family that has competed with Valencia for generations. To the Duke, this is a terrible time to have someone like that around, and he asks them to ensure everyone knows this is Valencia, not Roctor. The commander says he has already taken all necessary measures, and the Duke says that's good work. However, something else worries him. Then the Duke asks Jennaz if he has any illness he hasn't disclosed. Jennaz asks what his lord is talking about. The Duke takes on a serious demeanor, but decides to leave it for later, and says he just wants Jennaz not to handle everything in the ceremony alone. But the commander says it's fine since the princess is like a niece to him. The Duke remembers that, as a child, Khloe used to follow him around, and there was even a time when she thought she had 3 older brothers. Then he changes the subject, and asks if Jennaz plans to marry. The commander replies no and reminds his lord that he promised not to ask that again. Thus, the Duke apologizes. Jennaz says he seems a bit strange today, and the Duke simply says he's becoming more nervous as the coming-of-age ceremony approaches. Then he says his commander must be quite busy and dismisses him. His name is Jennaz Freewell, just the child who became commander after his father passed away. The Duke had asked the protagonist about him, but Tiny didn't recognize him or have any information about him. This makes the Duke wonder if Jennaz won't be by his side in the future. Moreover, it won't be because of a chronic illness or a marriage. However, Jennaz is a level 6 mana user and won't die in any ordinary battle. It will probably be because of the second catastrophe. At least that's what the Duke thinks. Back to the protagonist, he is training, and remembers talking about Jennaz. Thinking that the Sword Emperor's theory makes sense, there's a high probability something will happen on Khloe's wedding day. Perhaps more than one person is involved in it. Then, the princess appears alongside Vivian. Tiny asks if it's okay for her to be there since many guests are arriving, and he also asks if it's against etiquette for her to talk to him. Vivian even tried to warn her, but Khloe says it's boring being stuck in her room, and says that when she's with Tiny, she can hear interesting stories and even see the lunar wolf. The protagonist then offers her the wolf to borrow for a while, and the princess says that with the wolf by her side, she'll be able to endure much more. Suddenly, someone appears, calling her the Angel of Valencia and saying she is truly beautiful. The man apologizes for his boldness but claims the princess is the most beautiful woman he, Thybrin von Rochter, has ever had the pleasure of seeing. The princess is startled upon hearing that name, but Thybrin says he comes from a prestigious family that has been competing amicably with Valencia. Khloe maintains her polite demeanor and says it's a pleasure to meet him, and Thybrin wishes they could find time to celebrate their first meeting. She seems a bit startled, but Thybrin tells her not to pretend she doesn't know, claiming that he will become her life partner, and now that they've finally met, they should have a conversation. Thybrin even mentions that he brought an excellent wine from his estate. Angrily, Tiny wonders who this lunatic is to offer alcohol to a minor before announcing an engagement. Vivian steps forward, saying that Thybrin must step back because the princess is not allowed to interact with guests until the coming-of-age ceremony. Thybrin is surprised to see a female knight beside the princess, and asks how a woman dares to interrupt him. His guard then tries to intimidate Vivian, saying she should step aside, as this is a conversation between young aristocrats. However, Vivian responds that this situation goes far beyond what he imagines. Thybrin's guard says his master is being sincere and that he was ill for a few years. He hopes the princess can understand, even if his master seems a bit rude. Thybrin agrees and asks for at least a chance. From afar, the protagonist observes everything, and he thinks that this guy is even stranger than the last idiot. Determined to make him pay for this, Tiny calls Khloe his sister, and adopting a completely childish demeanor, asks who these strange people are. Thybrin immediately asks who this insolent boy is, and orders Graham, his guard, to get rid of him at once. But without warning, Tiny advances and delivers a solid slap to Thybrin, calling him trash and throwing him far away, claiming that he is an expert. Seeing his master attacked, Graham prepares to act. However, he too is struck and even loses a few teeth. From a distance, the fight between them can be seen. An aristocrat notices that a boy just knocked down a knight with a mere slap, and is incredulous at the sight. Seeing the boy leave his opponents on the ground, the man wonders who this boy is. After being struck like that, Graham wonders how it ended up this way. He remembers receiving the order to bring Thybrin to the princess because his master said it would cause a scandal in Valencia. However, at the time, Graham pointed out that it would also tarnish the Rochter name, but his master said Thybrin would soon be expelled from the family. This information left Graham deeply surprised. His master explained that if everything went well, it might even be good for that piece of trash and instructed Graham to act like he knew nothing and just follow the plan. He even added that he would look forward to seeing Graham complete his task. Back in the present, after being hit with just one slap, he fell. From above, the aristocrat observes a high-ranking knight and an expert, wondering who that boy is. His companion says he is a legendary genius, or rather, a monster. The aristocrat is soon amazed that the Duke of Valencia has someone like that under his protection, and says he must meet that boy one day. Speaking of which, he asks if Duke Alone von Rochter is really doing everything to get closer to the imperial family. His companion replies that Roctor obviously wouldn't want to stay away from the imperial family's view and is probably trying to end the relationship between them. The aristocrat quickly realizes that Roctor is trying to tarnish Valencia's reputation, and notes that it has been many years since the Duke of Valencia became an Auror. His companion says that Alone just doesn't want to be left behind by Valencia. These words make sense to him, so he concludes that his companion is right. He then wants to deal with those idiots first, and says that at least they didn't have the decency to arrive quietly. However, his companion says his lord won't need to go there, because it seems that the children of Valencia care a lot about their youngest, and they are all already back. Later, the Duke speaks with the protagonist, and says that Thybron has been expelled from Roctor, and thanks to that, Tiny won't need to come up with an excuse for hitting a noble. The protagonist says that's good, but the Duke disagrees. He calls it an unfortunate event, and asks the boy to control himself. The Duke asks if he's trying to end up in prison before the Demon King's army attacks. Tiny tries to justify himself, claiming the two behaved poorly, but the Duke says he already knew that, and states that he himself would love to beat up that idiot Thybron. Furious, the Duke asks how he dared to enter Valencia and go after his daughter, saying he deserved what happened. Tiny wonders if this is the same man who just asked him to control himself. Outside the room, he sees two men approaching. They run down the hallway, shouting how dare that bastard touch Khloe, saying he deserves to be taught a lesson. The protagonist thinks he has seen them somewhere before. However, one of them ends up bumping into the boy, and immediately falls to the ground. The other one is surprised by this, because he sees a specialist being pushed by a child. But upon seeing the protagonist's aura, he asks if the boy is Tiny, the boy who fought Drexler. Tiny replies yes, but says that Drexler lost on purpose and didn't even use his spirit weapon. They then say the rumors were true, and that it makes sense for his father to have given him his vision. They also say it's a shame they met under these circumstances, but they are busy now, so they will meet him later. Soon after, they continue running after Thybron, saying they won't let him leave Valencia alive. Aaron says he wants to be the first to punch him in the face. Thus, the protagonist realizes that he is Aaron, the heir of Valencia, which is why he seemed familiar. However, he wonders who the other guy with him was since there was only one young master in Valencia in the future. Then he wonders if the same thing happened as with Jenas. This issue with the imperial family of Aslan irritates him, because the imperial family always considered Aslan's lineage the most noble. Only those from Aslan's lineage were allowed to attend the banquet. Even Valencia's guests had a very limited and small number, without even imagining the consequences. The protagonist knows that the blood of the noble golden dragon froze to death, but then his thoughts are interrupted, because the aristocrat from earlier appears and says it's always good to check the surroundings for the slightest noise. Tiny asks who he is, and sees that his face is fake, created by magic. The noble says he hasn't introduced himself yet, and says he is Baron Redley von Narsa, a guest at the princess's coming-of-age ceremony. He also says he heard rumors that Tiny defeated a knight, and wanted to meet him, so he asks if the boy is from Valencia. In turn, Tiny replies no and says the Duke is just looking after him for a while. Redley says the Duke of Valencia really has a good eye. Seriously, Tiny says this is Valencia, and the Baron should be careful about what he says regarding the Duke. Baron Redley says he deserved that and asks if they are even now, making the protagonist question his age. Redley says that if they are even giving each other advice, he thinks they can already be considered friends, and he asks if he can treat Tiny to dinner to celebrate their friendship. He tells the boy not to refuse, claiming that if he agrees, the two will have fun and build a loyal friendship. Tiny thinks he should just beat him up and uncover his true identity, but he remembers that the Duke told him to control himself and stay calm. However, the Baron then mentions that he heard the protagonist is close to the princess, and asks if he thinks the two of them could meet. Before he could say anything more inappropriate, Tiny wastes no time and lands a solid slap on the arrogant man's face. Like the others, he goes flying out of there, and lands straight onto his servant. This leaves the protagonist satisfied, not caring at all about the consequences. After the Baron is sent flying, the protagonist realizes he might have overdone it. This angers the servant, who immediately charges to attack, calling the boy insolent. While he fights with a sword, the protagonist defends himself using only mana. Furious, the servant says he will break him into pieces. Tiny notices that the opponent is stronger than he expected, but looking closer at him, he realizes the man is controlling space with mana. This makes him a challenger. The opponent only wants to rip off the boy's hand for his insolence. Tiny, however, defends himself with his mana armor, and seizes the opportunity to summon his lunar wolf, but the opponent is determined not to let that happen. Upon seeing the wolf, he realizes the boy is an elementalist. However, the opening left by the opponent allows Tiny to attack, and he manages to land a punch on him. However, he is surprised after that, because the opponent stopped the punch with just his forehead and didn't even budge. Then the man grabs the boy, and throws him far away. As he falls, Tiny manages to land without injuring himself. But soon he realizes the opponent is approaching, ready to attack again. Then he turns to his wolf for help, while shielding himself with mana. Even so, he is struck. However, he manages to soften the blow. His opponent comments on his resilience, and declares he won't hold back anymore. With his sword, he moves to attack, but receives the order to stop. The Baron rises from the ground, claiming that the fault was his and not the boy's. After that, Tiny encounters Genis, who says he thought it would be good to meet him but didn't expect it to happen like this. Tiny apologizes, and Genis comments that he did seem a bit suspicious. The Baron, who is also present, asks for forgiveness. Genis says he'll let it slide this time. However, he warns him to keep one thing in mind, stating that Valencia is not such a forgiving place. He also tells Tiny that the person with the magical disguise has permission for it, leaving the protagonist feeling oppressed. Genis expresses high expectations for him, and claims that if he's a bit more cautious, he believes Tiny could become very promising. He then says he's a little busy, but Tiny wants to ask him something before he leaves. He questions him about the Baron. Genis replies that it's still confidential, unfortunately. The protagonist asks if he's someone connected to the Imperial family. This makes Genis think he said something he shouldn't have. Tiny concludes that it makes sense since Challenger class knights are so rare. Genis, however, tells him he must never repeat this. Tiny thinks to himself that he already knew about the arranged marriage and assumes the Baron must be some kind of Imperial inspector. After all, Khloe's coming-of-age ceremony has finally arrived, and they will likely announce her engagement to the Crown Prince. A week after the coming-of-age ceremony, Genis reflects on Khloe not as a princess, but as his younger sister, and vows to make this day the most beautiful of her life. However, he grows irritated hearing Tiny talk, as the boy is savoring the food and not paying attention to anything else. Tiny even tries to speak with Genis, but he's only focused on his duties. Genis tells Tiny to eat more slowly because there's plenty of food. Tiny tries to respond, but his mouth is full. Genis then tells him to stop eating before he breaks his jaws. The protagonist is startled by this, but Genis just thinks he's a growing boy lacking discipline. Soon after, the Baron approaches again, and asks if Tiny has time to speak with him instead of the busy Lord Genis. Tiny is surprised that the inspector showed up at the party, and admits he was a bit rude last time. He thanks him for his generosity in forgiving him. The Baron replies that it was his fault for asking the impossible and admires Tiny's defensive reaction at the time. He also says that if he's rude again, Tiny has permission to hit him because no one would dare retaliate. Feeling a little awkward, the protagonist wonders if this guy is some kind of masochist. After that, the Master of Ceremonies announces the star of the event, Princess Khloe von Valencia, who enters alongside her family. Her father accompanies her, along with her siblings, and the princess's charming smile lights up the room. Upon seeing this, the Baron is awestruck, remarking on how beautiful she is. Tiny doesn't like this at all and doesn't want to let it slide unnoticed. As the princess approaches, the guests call her the Angel of Valencia, due to her captivating beauty. Khloe, however, feels uneasy, and wonders if everything will change after today. Among the crowd is the protagonist, who is concerned about the princess, remembering her saying she considers him her brother. He then summons his lunar wolf, wishing her happiness in her new life. The wolf approaches the princess, brightening her day. The Duke and others are surprised by its appearance, except for the princess, who is enjoying herself, and trying to keep the wolf calm in her lap. Her father feels relieved that it isn't a threat. But suddenly, the wolf begins to transform, and shifts from its small form, growing larger and assuming its adult persona. Even so, it remains by her side. Seeing a spirit next to the princess, some guests think she's no different from a goddess. Even the Baron is impressed upon seeing the spirit's true form, and thanks the protagonist for the beautiful distraction. Tiny wonders why this guy is thanking him, finding it all too strange. Back at the ceremony, the Duke once again thanks Khloe for growing up healthy. He also says that if her mother were there to see her today, she would be very happy. The father's words to his daughter move many of the guests. However, not everyone seems to know the Duke's story, as one of them appears confused about it. In any case, the ceremony continues. The Duke places a necklace on his daughter, and all the guests are dazzled. The Master of Ceremonies announces that now comes the highlight of the evening and says it's time to present the princess's fiancé. The Duke then declares that his daughter's fiancé is this person, pointing to the hall, but not to someone physically present. Instead, it's a magical projection, displaying the fiancé for everyone to see. His name is Bradley Van Azren, and he says he's very happy to receive the Angel of Valencia as his companion, but he regrets not being able to attend this wonderful day in person. Vivian, who is present, is impressed because this young man is the heir to the throne. Meanwhile, the protagonist remembers that in his past life, Bradley died for nothing. The Baron says it's his turn, but the protagonist grabs him and asks where he's going, stating that it's not time to leave yet. The Baron says he knows about his concern for the princess. However, he insists the protagonist need not worry about him, and tells him to read his name, Narsa, backward. The protagonist quickly realizes that he is Ezrin. Then Bradley reveals his true identity and bids farewell to the boy. Tiny now understands who he was all along. Not only that, but he realizes he once hit the heir to the throne. Thus, he concludes that he's in deep trouble, and even considers letting him die at the wedding next year. Genas approaches and asks what Tiny is thinking about. He deflects, saying he's just feeling warm. But Genas reassures him, saying that His Highness has already forgiven him, and even if there's some resentment, he assures that, as long as Tiny is within Valencia's territory, he will be safe. It was the Crown Prince who sought this engagement to go against the wishes of His Majesty, the Emperor, who preferred the Roctor family. Tiny then understands that the prince favors Valencia. Genas has more to share and reveals he has a message from his master. He says everything is ready and instructs the boy to meet with the Duke after the ceremony ends. That's what happens, and the protagonist goes to the Duke's office. The old man thanks him for revealing the spirit, as it seems to have relaxed Khloe. Tiny says he didn't do anything significant and asks if everything is ready. The Duke replies yes, but honestly it's still a bit hard to believe. He explains that Humanitas, the sacred relic of Curran, has disappeared, and Orthus, the capital, was destroyed by the great demon Kraken's attack. Then he asks how it could possibly be Kraken, of all demons. Tiny says he needs to find out. The Duke says the agreement is over, and he can stop by the blacksmith to pick up his weapon. The next day, the blacksmith explains that he enhanced the weight and impact, added self-repair, and optimized the mana waves for him. Thinking about it, he says these specifications are quite unusual and asks what the protagonist intends to do. Tiny simply takes the hammer and asks if he can test it. The dwarf tells him to try hitting something with it, so the protagonist gets excited and says the weight is perfect. The story then cuts to a battle, where, with just one strike, he manages to defeat his enemy. He then says the hammer turned out better than expected, and thinks he needs to thank Master Rendell for the excellent work. After that, the lunar wolf signals something, and rushes into the forest. Tiny asks if it wants a moonlit race. He even remarks that the lunar wolf is in its best condition. For Tiny, this is perfect because they can reach their destination in a week since they are heading to the port of Anaxon. Elsewhere, far from there, one of the cultists reports that the Morse child has left the duchy, mounted on a superior class spirit beast, and is moving 4 times faster than usual. Another asks what the route is. The first replies that the nearest port is Curran's, in Anaxon, which shocks the others. Their leader says this is more than irritating, and this time, he wants to handle it personally, and orders the others to call the trainer. On the road, the protagonist encounters an ambush and asks who these idiots are. The men don't like being called that, and ask if the boy still hasn't fully grasped the situation. They know the boy is at an expert level but claim he's just an elementalist against 5 of their best men. They also say that this boy needs a wake-up call, because they, the Black Knights, will teach him a lesson. At that moment, an archer shoots an arrow at the protagonist. Meanwhile, Tiny mocks the entire group. He deflects the enemy's arrow with just his hand, surprising everyone else, as they believe such a defense is impossible. But one of them shouts to the others not to be afraid, claiming it was just a cheap trick and that they have the numbers advantage. Hearing this, Tiny says the best remedy for foolishness is a good beating, and with his hammer, he strikes one of them. The others are terrified of the boy's strength, and wonder if this is truly the power of an expert. The one who was struck is sent flying. Meanwhile, the protagonist remarks that real knights are amazing, but they are just followers of the demon. The leader of the group is in shock, and starts running, claiming they weren't paid for this. Tiny, however, doesn't want to let them escape, so he dismounts his wolf, and with a single strike to the ground, intends to kill them all. Immediately, he hits the ground with his hammer, causing a massive impact and cracking the earth. In this way, the enemies are swallowed by the ground. Tiny, still standing, watches his enemies defeated and fallen. Ironically, he says his hammer turned out amazing, and plans to use it even as he grows up. However, he still doesn't know how these idiots knew where he was heading, and thinks he should have spared one to interrogate. Just then, he hears the sound of a tree falling beside him, that nearly hit him. His wolf managed to dodge the attack. After that, Tiny notices something gigantic approaching, and realizes it's a 2-headed troll that is furious about an intruder in its territory. It quickly starts chasing the boy, and while preparing to flee, Tiny wonders why a high-class monster is there. Monster classification is determined based on their partnerships. This means a Class 5 monster is cooperating with a 5th Circle mage or a superior mana user. Knowing this, the protagonist is puzzled about how and why such a troll is right in front of him. He then tries to escape with his wolf. While running, he sees that the troll is being controlled by someone who refers to the protagonist as trash that only gets in their way. The mage orders the troll to crush the boy like a worm. This makes Tiny realize that the reason a monster like this appeared is that it has a mage as its master. So, he orders his wolf to go after the mage and leave the troll to him. However, the mage won't let that happen, so he uses the troll as a shield. The giant then attacks, preventing the protagonist from advancing. Not only that, but it ends up cutting down several trees, making Tiny's situation even harder. He realizes the monster is of the berserk type. Before he can react, the troll appears behind him and tries to catch him off guard, but Tiny narrowly escapes. He knows that class 5 trolls have strength enhancement and regeneration abilities, but the berserk mode has its limitations, and he just needs to hold out until an opening appears. The giant tries to attack the boy with some kind of acid breath. However, Tiny uses a mana shield. He also notices that the enemies are alone, so they shouldn't be using up so much mana. Before he can think further, the troll attacks again. Tiny tries to counter it with his hammer, as it's too late to dodge. In doing so, he manages to push the giant back, and as soon as the troll hits the ground, Tiny jumps to try to attack it by surprise. He lands the hit, making the troll scream in pain, because his hammer has weight and impact amplification. Afterward, the troll manages to get up. Despite being struck in the knee, it resumes its attacks. Tiny dodges the enemy's blows, and moves into counterattack, because he doesn't want to give the giant any respite. From a distance, the mage observes everything, and wonders how long the protagonist will keep running, claiming that the moment he's caught, it will all be over. Back in the fight, the protagonist ends up in a dead-end path, finding himself cornered. The troll is about to strike him, when suddenly, the magic controlling it is interrupted. Seeing this, the mage becomes desperate as the berserk mode ends. Tiny asks if he really thought he wouldn't retaliate, claiming he was just waiting for an opening in the enemy's frenzy. The mage hadn't expected such intelligence from the boy. Thus, he becomes vulnerable, and the wolf manages to grab him and attacks him, preventing the enemy from fighting back. Tiny tells his wolf it did a great job. He also tells it to hold the mage tightly. Meanwhile, he charges at the troll, attacking it with all his strength. As a result, a massive explosion occurs, leaving the troll's 2 heads in the protagonist's hands. He approaches the mage and asks if he wants to play too. After a few questions, Tiny learns that the organization's headquarters is in the lawless city of the Alliance, and asks if the mage's boss is the mayor there. The mage answers yes. Tiny says that it definitely isn't those two, but the mage doesn't understand the statement. He knows his wolf is a spirit beast and has a spell for explosions. Then, Tiny says he can't let a 5th-class beast-taming mage go so easily, and asks if they're planning to steal Curran's relic. The mage insists they are not, which makes Tiny think he was right. He only wants to know one more thing and asks the name of the person who gave this mission, claiming he'll let the mage go afterward. The enemy hesitates to respond, but the protagonist tells him to think carefully, and asks if he's ever heard of a head suddenly exploding. The mage responds that he thinks he has. Tiny asks if he thinks the chances of that happening to him are low just because he's in Tiny's hands now. The mage panics at hearing this and doesn't know how to react. A little later, the protagonist is walking in the port city of Anaxon. The people around are wondering who set off fireworks after seeing a massive explosion in the sky. Tiny remembers the Duke telling him the agreement was over and that he'd wait for him at the bar in Anaxon. After walking for a bit, he finds the place. Then, upon entering the bar, he is surprised, because he didn't imagine he'd have reinforcement. The Sword Emperor himself. The man apologizes to the boy, and says his shop doesn't sell alcohol to children. The protagonist notices the change in his face and is incredulous. He wonders if it's magical makeup, but he can't sense any mana. Some drunks tell the protagonist that this isn't a place for kids and even laugh at his hair. They even say that all the other customers have already left. However, due to their mockery, the lunar wolf scares them and puts them in their place. It then returns to the protagonist. With this, Tiny says they can't ignore him. The shopkeeper sees a black-haired spiritualist and concludes that the boy wants the house's special menu. He apologizes for not recognizing him sooner, and then takes him to another room. Alone, the protagonist shows his badge. The man recognizes it as the Duke's certification, with the symbol of Valencia's secret organization, Blackwing. Not only are they the best warriors, but they are also the best at handling information and personal connections. The man introduces himself as Jay and says he is the commander of the Black Wings. Tiny understands this means Jay is literally the chief and has a question. He says that if Jay is the leader, he should at least be a blader class, but he didn't sense any mana from him, and asks how the leader manages to hide it. Jay replies that he hasn't awakened the use of mana. He also says that sometimes the tricks for hiding mana become the hardest disguises to detect. Then he uses the Duke's face again, leaving the protagonist thoroughly impressed. Jay explains that it's just a simple disguise. Tiny then thinks he wasn't wrong and asks Jay if this isn't very dangerous. Jay replies that's what makes it all so exciting, making the protagonist think he has strange tastes. Then Jay says they should focus on their work, not on his personal preferences. Jay reveals that Gail Anderson, the tsunami mage, who was supposed to receive a recommendation letter, is missing. This information leaves Tiny quite surprised, because Tsunami Mage is a title given to a 7th circle mage. The protagonist asks if he shouldn't be especially stronger since he's near the sea, given the title. Jay says they lost contact with the mage during his voyage, and it's been 2 weeks since his expected return date. Tiny then says it's hard to make any recommendations in such a situation, but Jay says he had a plan B ready, and tells the boy to meet his new identity, showing him a new crest. The protagonist asks if he's sure the Sword Emperor sent him for this. He also asks if Jay knows the name Hustle, but it doesn't seem like he does. Tiny then says that Hustle is the demon follower responsible for the current incident, and claims he received this information just before blowing someone's head off. After thinking for a moment, Jay says the name sounds like it belongs to an orc or beast and decides to keep it in mind. Then, one of Jay's servants calls him, telling him to hurry because they are here. Tiny asks who they are, but Jay just says he has to leave, because it means the big players have arrived. Soon, the protagonist imagines that something bad is about to happen. However, in the shop's hall, a grand party is taking place. Tiny comes across the so-called big players, who turn out to be a large group of hungry customers. The waiters are unhappy with the overwhelming crowd. This makes the protagonist wonder why a friend restaurant is doing so well. 2 days later, aboard the ship Flaxen, the boatman says they'll depart soon, until a hooded figure asks if this is the ship to Curran. Afterward, a sailor identifies the figure as a child and asks where their identification is. Tiny, who had been keeping a low profile until then, shows the identification given to him by Jay. Immediately, the sailor realizes he's a noble, and wonders why a noble is there without an escort. He quickly apologizes for his oversight. The protagonist says it's fine, as he's just a fallen noble now, even though he doesn't fully understand. The boatman wishes him a safe journey. Meanwhile, Tiny recalls Jay mentioning a noble family called Moors that was accused of being demon followers and disappeared 40 years ago. Black hair and dark eyes were marks of their descendants, but with so few heirs, they couldn't recover over time. From now on, Tiny must assume the identity of one of the Moors who fled and had a child with an elf. Tiny has to take on this disguise now, but thinks that even as an elementalist, it's still a bit strange. Then, he starts to feel a bit different, and quickly realizes there is magic within the ship. The protagonist senses a presence, but doesn't see anything unusual around him. He knows, however, that there's more than 1 or 2 presences, and wonders what their purpose is. He even considers that they might be planning to sacrifice everyone aboard. In a moment of distraction, a man tries to catch Tiny off guard, but his instincts won't let that happen. The protagonist quickly grabs the man's hand, and breaks it, stopping the attack. The man's scream immediately draws everyone's attention, and the ship's crew becomes terrified, especially when they see blood gushing out. One of the sailors asks the boy what he's doing. Meanwhile, the man demands to be released. His knife falls to the ground, but Tiny uses his foot to lift it, and then kicks it midair, hitting the man squarely with his own weapon. The others are left speechless at the sight, as they watch the man writhing in pain and bleeding profusely. However, knowing the man's evil nature, the protagonist feels no pity. As soon as it's over, a dark aura of magic begins to emanate from the corpse. This confuses the others even more. Not just the smoke, but a foul smell also starts to spread among them. They quickly realize the man was a demon follower. A sailor thanks the protagonist for getting rid of him, but says his methods were a bit extreme. Tiny, in turn, grabs the sailor's hand as well, and ironically asks if he was talking about this. Then, he repeats the same move as before, taking this man down onto the ship's floor. Not just him, but another one was also struck. The protagonist doesn't stop attacking them, as he suspects there are more demon followers around. He even uses human bodies as weapons. People start fleeing, thinking he's a serial killer. However, one of the crew members finally realizes that everyone the boy attacked was also a demon follower. Tiny, with a serious expression, looks at his last target, the one who seemed to be the ship's captain. The captain comes up to the deck and asks what's happening. Seeing the bodies, he asks how this could have happened. Then, he spots the protagonist, and immediately apologizes for the inconvenience. It seems this chaos was caused by demonic followers, and he would like the boy's cooperation in a future investigation. Tiny laughs and says he is a great captain, and also an excellent actor. Without wasting any time, he attacks the captain with his hammer, hurling him away and crushing him with the impact. The people, already shocked, become even more terrified. They look toward where the captain's body landed, and see that he, too, was a demonic follower. In the city, someone reports what happened, saying these demonic followers were responsible for the Flaxen operation 5 years ago. 5 low-level sailors, 2 specialist-level navigators, along with the captain, who was a Blader-class knight. King Imud Van Karen is impressed by this information. Tiny hears the reporter speculate that hundreds, or even thousands of people may have been sacrificed to the demon, and wonders which demon the demonic followers serve, as some demons can even cross dimensional walls and spread their power. The sacrifices are used in rituals that both strengthen the demonic followers and grant significant power to the demon they serve. To Tiny, people who submit to this are the vermin of humanity. The king says they have been in hiding for 30 years, and even he let his guard down. But he says that, thanks to the elemental spirit user with elven blood, a great disaster was avoided. He also mentions knowing that the boy's spirit can track demonic followers and asks if he can see this spirit. His servant says that even if he is an elf descendant, it's still very dangerous. However, this is not a problem for the protagonist, as he summons his spiritual wolf and reveals it before the king. Upon seeing the spiritual wolf, the king is astonished, saying the creature is incredible and magnificent. Now that he sees the spirit with his own eyes, he can believe it. He also says he would like to speak with the boy in private and asks his servants to leave, surprising them. Even the protagonist didn't expect this, as it's not common for a king to meet alone with a stranger, leaving him very intrigued about what will happen next. The king's servants ask His Majesty to reconsider, as they don't want to leave him alone with someone unknown. However, the king insists and says it won't take long. Thus, they comply with the order and leave. Now Tiny is face to face with the king alone. The king tells the young hero they don't need to worry about others overhearing, and asks if it's a lie that he is descended from elves. Already suspecting the answer, the king says he would like to know the protagonist's true purpose for being there. Hearing this, Tiny wonders where he went wrong. The king says that, after living for so long, one hears plenty of information. For example, that elves don't actually have black hair. The king tells the protagonist not to worry, claiming only members of his family know this information. Embarrassed, Tiny apologizes for the lie, and says he was hunting demonic followers, because he's trying to stop them from stealing relics and causing further damage in Curran. The king says that apparently, the protagonist truly is worthy of the empire. He also mentions that Curran is a neutral country, but still part of the Union of Kingdoms. The king states that it's very difficult to trust an empire that goes against the Union. He then asks if that's why the boy hid his identity, even though his intentions were good. In any case, the king decides to trust the boy's words, making Tiny remember why he is known as a wise king. The king says the boy is a spirit user with a pure soul, which makes Tiny think even a wise man cannot avoid prejudice. Because elemental spirit users deal with the essence of mana and spirits, they are natural enemies of demonic cultists. But just because of this, they are labeled as good people. In his past life, there was one who was entirely the opposite of this concept of goodness, and this bothers the protagonist a little. However, setting that aside, he wishes to ask the king for a favor. He asks to be sent to the sanctuary guard to try to resolve Curran's catastrophe. The king agrees, and even says he'll give the boy some credit for defeating those demonic followers on the ship. With that, one of his servants presents a sword and a crest. However, the king says that since he doesn't like long ceremonies, he wants to skip all the sword ceremony formalities, because the protagonist has already proven his worth as a knight. And in the name of the royal family of Curran, Tiny Von Morris is appointed as a knight. He is ordered to serve as a protector of the sacred relics. The protagonist thinks this is the first knightly title he's earned in this life. He then tells his sister Irina that he's starting anew, but this time, he'll certainly do better. Before leaving, he has something to say to the king. He mentions a man named Hustle as being behind this case, claiming that he heard this name being used among beasts and orcs. With that, he asks if the king knows anything about it. The king asks if he's sure about this information, but the king's expression surprises the protagonist. Tiny explains that the information came from a fifth circle mage, right before he exploded his head. After that, the king simply tells Tiny to leave, as he needs to think more about it. Elsewhere, far away, a mage summons a creature. Seeing this, another man appears, saying it's perfect, because it looks like a tsunami mage. The mage who performed the summoning seems to have done so forcibly, but standing before him is Hustle, stating that a child managed to see through the veil, and things won't go as he wishes. Back at the king's castle, the protagonist is introduced to the other knights as someone who dealt with the demon followers from Flaxen. Mason, the sanctuary guard and member of the army, states that the boy is half-elf, so they shouldn't underestimate him just because he looks young. And despite being a knight who has barely left his cradle, this is because he proved his power and was knighted for it. The other guards are confused. Even the protagonist doesn't fully understand what just happened. Earlier, he had asked the king if it was really okay to send him there so easily, as it could provoke opposition within the palace. But the king told him not to worry, as for hundreds of years, it's been Curran's army, not the sacred relic guards, who protect Ordos. The sacred relic is now just a symbol, so guarding it shouldn't be more than a tedious task. This leads the protagonist to conclude that this is a job for a bunch of failures with no future. Even though there may not be any external resistance within the unit, it's a different story. He then tries to speak with Lord Mason. However, the guard says they are a single unit, and there is a hierarchy there. Before Mason can continue, the protagonist summons his lunar wolf to intimidate the others. He says he doesn't know much about this hierarchy stuff, but he does know how to burn a demon follower if necessary. He then asks if the others know how to as well. No way, they reply. Thus, the protagonist says he hopes to get along well with everyone. Speaking of which, he's still concerned about the king's reaction, which might indicate he knows who Hustle is. Soon after, someone appears, asking if the boy is the elemental specialist who defeated all those demon cultists. The man approaches the protagonist and says it's a pleasure to meet him, introducing himself as Truman, the sanctuary guard captain. Tiny also says it's an honor to meet him, but upon analyzing Truman, he realizes the man is just an expert, weak for a captain. Regardless, Truman heard that the boy volunteered to join the guard, and asks if it's because of an interest in divine artifacts. The protagonist decides to confront him to figure out the old man's intentions, and wonders if he's connected to the current calamity. However, Truman reacts entirely differently, becoming excited and saying the protagonist came to the right place, leaving Tiny completely taken aback. Truman explains that the artifacts are merely symbols, and their sole purpose is to repel evil creatures, but they only work within a 1 kilometer radius, and rarely block demonic energy above level 1. Yet, the more one studies them, the more one realizes they go beyond that. He recommends some books for the protagonist to read, and asks if he's ever heard about the promise of mythological times, claiming that the divine artifacts are treasures safeguarded by humanity since ancient times. Tiny realizes that's why he didn't sense any demonic energy in the old man and almost accused the wrong person. Truman continues his lecture, explaining that even the most evil creatures are subjected to the power of the artifacts created by the gods. But seeing the boy nearly falling asleep, he says he understands it's much better to see the artifacts than to read about them. The old man then stands up and tells the boy to follow him, as he's going to show him a divine artifact in person. Thus, they walk toward the location, in the interior of the castle, in the central section. As they approach the door, the old man asks Tiny if he knows why the sanctuary guards are considered obsolete. The protagonist asks if it's because they claim artifacts are just worthless symbols. Truman says the real reason is much simpler. Then he opens the door, and Tiny is awestruck. Both head toward the divine artifact called Humanitas, and the old man explains that the reason is that the artifacts don't need protection. Tiny is deeply impressed by the artifact as he sees it up close. The old man says the artifact floats, but they don't know why. There's also a legend that says, the unworthy shall not touch it, and that alone is enough for the artifact to require no protection. Then he tells Tiny to try touching the artifact to see if he's worthy, but to the old man's surprise, the boy succeeds. Not only that, but Tiny realizes that it's a 7th degree artifact, a mass of light that harms absolutely nothing in the world, and its power rejects everything not of this world. Tiny notices the barrier is speaking, and that only he can hear it, so he asks if it's due to his sensitivity to mana. The glow makes the protagonist realize that the barrier itself is also an artifact. It even moves. Truman is very impressed by all of this, because he realizes the boy is communicating with the artifact. Back in the training grounds, the old man says the protagonist has a talent for surprising people. He also says he's been there for many years and has never seen anything like it. Tiny thinks the old man may not be strong, but he loves his work and performs it diligently, making him very different from the other members. Soon after, they encounter a knight from the Imperial Order, Greg Simbo. Truman asks what he's doing there. Greg replies that he didn't come because of the captain. He then approaches the protagonist and asks if he's the much-acclaimed half-elf saint. The protagonist says he's just a quarter-elf and not truly a saint. Greg refuses to believe in a hero who punished the dark mages, and asks how the boy dares to spout such nonsense. Then he declares he'll expose the boy's mask and charges to attack. Tiny had been expecting some resistance anyway, so he dodges the attack, and grabs the knight's hand to throw him down, just as he did to the others on the ship. And so he does, slamming the knight twice his size and weight to the ground, causing a loud noise with his fall. Still, Greg refuses to give in. Tiny, in turn, thinks that if the knight can still talk, it means he went too easy on him. So he grabs the knight's arm again, swinging him side to side and slamming him into the ground. From a distance, the old man observes everything, making Tiny wonder if he should maintain decorum or not. He tries to keep his composure, thanking Greg for teaching him so much, leaving the old man even more confused. But he wasn't the only one observing the protagonist. Further away, another knight saw everything and found it interesting. Other knights attempt to challenge the protagonist. One of them, named Robert Dumbbell of the Imperial Knights, heard that Tiny defeated Greg, and wanted to verify it. but the way he found out wasn't ideal, as Tiny landed a solid punch on his face. Tannen Royer and Edgar Albert, also from the Imperial Knights, present themselves to challenge the boy. However, they stood no chance, as the protagonist didn't spare them from public humiliation until another challenger appears. His name is Randolph Grantchess, commander of the Imperial Knights Order, and he proposes a duel against Tiny, but on the first hammer strike he receives, he's already sent flying. The protagonist says that, at least, he's a little less useless than the others. He also says he did him a favor by not finishing him off and now wants a favor in return. Tiny then asks if he knows someone named Hustle. Randolph replies that he doesn't know anyone by that name. This leaves the protagonist slightly puzzled, because no one he interrogated knows Hustle. Afterward, another knight appears, saying he's impressed that the boy defeated Randolph. Tiny asks who he is, thinking this might be someone of a higher class, or a beginner-level challenger. Either way, the man introduces himself as Liam von Peterson, Grand Master of the Imperial Knights. Maintaining his composure, Tiny apologizes for his rudeness, addressing the Grand Master as Your Excellency. Liam says he doesn't need to be so formal, claiming that an old man like him is just happy to see such a talented young man in action, and he asks if the protagonist would duel him as well, to relieve his boredom and provide information about Hustle. The Grand Master says that a duel is sufficient compensation, surprising Tiny with this proposal, because he didn't expect a martial artist with challenger-level mana to challenge him to a duel, let alone offer the reward he's been seeking all this time. Liam says he'll go easy on the boy but tells him to do his best. Tiny smiles, as this is exactly what he wanted, and says he'd be an idiot to refuse. He immediately leaps toward his opponent, ready to strike him with his hammer, thanking him for the duel. However, Liam manages to defend himself, and the impact of the blow even shakes the ground. Tiny warns him that if he underestimates him, he might get seriously hurt. The Grand Master notices that the boy has become lighter. When Tiny tries to sweep him off his feet, he can't, facing greater resistance, and realizes his opponent has a stone attribute. Liam looks at the boy and says he's quite entertaining. Tiny doesn't falter, and creates some distance between himself and his opponent. He had anticipated that. This is a defensive ability of an entry-level challenger class. The heavy, resilient knight clad in shining armor declares that he's taking back his promise to go easy on the boy. Now that he's seen what Tiny can do, he won't hold back his strength when attacking, saying that it'll be more fun this way. The protagonist doesn't feel differently from his opponent, and doesn't intend to hold back either. He swings his hammer, and thinks there's no advice he could offer about Liam's skill, only that what might be lacking is experience and accomplishments. The way Liam shifts his center of gravity to gain momentum, and the way he channels strength into his weapon, makes the protagonist think that he should be taking tips from his opponent instead. Liam says that the title of genius isn't enough for the boy, claiming that he's actually a monster. To Tiny, that's a genuine compliment, as he already sees himself that way. Liam then states that he thinks this is enough. He strikes the ground, causing the protagonist to lose his sense of balance, making him more vulnerable to attacks. However, even with difficulty, Tiny manages to defend himself, but he ends up being thrown by his opponent. Liam then says they should stop, as things have gone far enough. Tiny thanks him for the duel, but the Grand Master says this was a new experience for him, even at his age, and that he should be the one expressing gratitude. To show his appreciation, he agrees to provide the promised information. However, the protagonist is surprised by what the Grand Master reveals. Liam says it's the first time he's felt this way at his age. Tiny thinks it was a lie that there was no talent in Curran. The Grand Master then promises to give him the information he needs, leaving Tiny excited to finally get the answers he's been looking for. Liam explains that there's a man named Littman, who belongs to the Imperial Knight Order but only takes orders from His Majesty. The protagonist is surprised because he wanted information on Hustle, not Littman. The Grand Master says that's all he knows about Littman's duties, but it seems he's been wandering through various places, so perhaps he knows this Hustle that the boy is seeking. He asks if Tiny would like him to arrange a meeting, but before he can answer, one of the guards calls for Tiny, saying that His Majesty is urgently looking for him. This catches the protagonist off guard. Regardless, he goes to the king, who says that the man beside him has found the person Tiny has been searching for. The king introduces him as a specialist from the Eastern Continental route, Lord Littman. Tiny is confused because they've already found him, and he hasn't even asked about him yet. Moreover, if this is Littman, the protagonist wonders if he's the same man Lord Liam just mentioned. Littman greets Tiny, saying it's a pleasure to meet him and calling him the hero who massacred the demon followers, asking if the boy has been looking for him. Tiny says yes and replies that it's a pleasure to meet him as well. The king notices that something is off with the boy. Meanwhile, Tiny thinks that if His Majesty was going to stage this spectacle, he could have at least warned him beforehand. Littman tries to speak with the protagonist, but Tiny quickly says that, given his appearance, He thinks his roots might be from the eastern continent. So when the king asked what he wanted, he answered that he wanted to go there at least once. Soon, Lippmann says that His Majesty gives very generous rewards. He also mentions that over the past decade, every time they discovered a new route, he also received undeserved favors. Even so, the king tells Tiny not to leave for the east immediately, claiming that he must keep his promise to eliminate the base of the demonic cultists before departing, something Tiny intends to fulfill. Tiny is puzzled by how suddenly the king mentioned the demonic followers. He immediately becomes suspicious of Lippmann, and analyzes him from head to toe. However, he doesn't detect any dark aura in him. Then he concludes that Lippmann is clean, and in any case, if he were a demonic follower, his lunar wolf wouldn't have stayed idle and would have acted already. However, upon closer inspection, he notices a type of mana. That seems like a mix of beast and human. Thinking about what Jay said, it starts to make sense. Lippmann says that to respond without hesitation, one must be a competent saint. The king declares that Lippmann will assist Tiny in eradicating the demonic followers. Lippmann asks what the king means by that, since he was supposed to begin searching for Sir Gale the following day, but the king tells him to cancel that mission, claiming that eliminating the threats in front of them is more important, and that the best person he can mobilize right now is Lippmann himself. This leaves Lippmann slightly frustrated, but even though he's concerned about Gale, he understands that he must obey the king's orders. Tiny observes him and detects no demonic energy, but he believes Lippmann is Hustle. Later, he meets with the king, and says that Lippmann is not a demonic follower. The king understands but still says it's good to be sure, and asks Tiny to confirm it himself while working alongside Lippmann. The protagonist asks why the king didn't say so earlier, and the king replies that he had no choice. Tiny then asks if it's due to a mana oath. The king confirms it. This type of oath is bound with mana, creating a lightning discharge equivalent to the circle level of those who break their promises. A promise made in the third circle causes a small shock, but it can become a burden if one doesn't have much time left to live. Tiny then asks why the king is doing all this, considering that Lord Lippmann has been loyal to the king for decades, while the protagonist is only meeting His Majesty for the second time. The king says that they, of Curran's blood, upon living to such an age, begin to experience strange premonitions. A dream where the sacred relic vanishes, and demons destroy the entire capital. A dream the king has repeatedly had, day after day. Tiny appeared out of nowhere, and said the sacred relic would disappear. That was enough to raise suspicions. It would be great for the king if it were just an old man's random dream. If this ended only with the resentment of a loyal subject, then the protagonist feels something different, and realizes Hustle is no longer there. Wondering if he left the palace, Tiny rushes off mounted on the lunar wolf, and thinks that not even his wolf could detect demonic energy, so he wonders if the real Hustle is somewhere else. But if that's the case, why would he flee at such a time? To the protagonist, the answer is quite obvious, and he just needs to gather some evidence to prove his point. At the city's port, some men are loading equipment onto a ship. One of them tells the others to move the boxes quietly, as they work at night specifically to avoid drawing attention. Then a hooded man appears, and catches their attention. The man removes his hood, revealing himself as Lippmann, but the men recognize him as Lord Hustle, and ask what he's doing there since they were expecting him only the next day. Hustle explains that something's happened. He says the king has put the boy on his trail. One of the sailors says the boy hasn't seemed to be around for a while, but Hustle admits he doesn't know what's on his mind. He orders the men to hurry because he wants to leave immediately. The sailors comply and rush with the preparations. However, what they didn't expect was for their ship to explode out of nowhere. Not only that, but it's rendered incapable of departing, as it's split in half, and standing on the ship's bow is the protagonist, asking what they're up to in the middle of the night, and calling them demon worshippers. The others immediately recognize it as an ambush. But before they can do anything, the protagonist strikes the ground with his hammer. Hustle sees that the boy has already taken down 4 of his men. Ironically, Tiny asks if anyone else wants to enjoy eternal sleep. Those still alive call him a monster. In turn, Hustle remarks that the boy may be a follower of God, but he's only at the expert class level, and must already be exhausted from all the fighting. He also tells his men not to fall for it, claiming this must be the protagonist's plan to recover mana. Tiny admits he's been found out but says he doesn't care. Hustle comments that he didn't expect the boy to face him alone, and declares he will end him right now, but the protagonist tells him to try all he wants. Thus, the two begin their clash. Hustle attacks with his sword. Tiny counters with his warhammer. He manages to block an enemy attack, leaving his opponent very surprised. While Tiny holds the enemy's sword, he orders his wolf to attack. The lunar wolf strikes the opponent, drawing blood with its blow. Hustle, enraged, asks how they dare to leave a scar on his body. He also declares he'll tear the wolf apart right before the boy's eyes, claiming that when a spirit is forcefully summoned, even tamers like him are shocked. Tiny refuses to let this happen, but Hustle rushes toward the wolf, claiming he'll deal with it first, and then finish off its master. The lunar wolf stands its ground while taking the hits. Tiny grows deeply worried for his companion, yet the wolf walks toward him, still able to fight despite its injuries. Hustle notices this and is incredulous, believing his blow should have been devastating, but the wolf survived. He wonders how it resisted a reverse summoning. Not only that, but looking at the protagonist, Hustle realizes the boy is conserving mana by healing only the injured parts. Hustle calls it a terrifying talent, and resolves to kill him today. Hustle's men refuse to let him fight alone and charge at the protagonist. But with just one swing of his hammer, Tiny takes them all down. This allows him to refocus on the main enemy. As he advances, he calls Hustle a lunatic beastman. Tiny tells his wolf they're running low on mana, and advises it to focus only on moving. Hustle realizes the king must have told Tiny about him, claiming that old man doesn't know how to be grateful. Tiny takes offense at how the enemy speaks. A flashback shows that when Tiny discovered Hustle had left the castle, the king warned him that Hustle was a man with many stories. Lobists usually inherit the powers of terrestrial animals, but sometimes mutants are born among them. However, wolfmen kill these children immediately because they remind them of the ancestral sirens who defied their god. Tiny asks why the king is suddenly telling him this. The king explains that he once encountered a mutant, who somehow survived and concealed his true identity to live outside his native village. Since the king needed his abilities, he swore on his mana to keep the mutant's identity a secret. But while sharing this, the king suffered severe damage due to the oath. Back in the present battle, Hustle asks if the king didn't mention anything else about him. After that, he uses magic to manipulate the seawater. At this moment, Tiny recalls the king's warning that if Hustle ever became his enemy, he should never fight him near the ocean. A crucial detail the protagonist forgot to consider. Now he realizes Hustle is a mutation of a killer whale. By the sea, Hustle prepares to attack. He fights by launching water blasts toward the protagonist. Tiny, struggling, manages to dodge, but Hustle continues his relentless magical assault. With each strike, the water blasts grow stronger, heading straight for Tiny. Amid the fight, Tiny notices that Hustle's aura weapon grows more powerful with water. Eventually, Tiny gets hit, and Hustle declares that it's over. But what seemed unlikely happens. Tiny, along with his wolf, emerges from the wave, ready to fight again. As he attacks, the protagonist tells Hustle that he's the only one who will die today. Still shocked, Hustle tries to defend himself from the boy's relentless strikes. He also notices that Tiny's regeneration is abnormal. Hustle grows frustrated, realizing reinforcements should be arriving soon. But he knows he can't let this drag on any longer and tries to hold his ground as best he can. Hustle moves away, and the protagonist assumes he's fleeing, especially upon seeing the enemy diving into the water. This leaves Tiny quite frustrated. However, he soon realizes it's not exactly the case, as Hustle reappears, stating that he's not just any ordinary specialist, and claiming he will delay his death a bit longer. Then he dives once more. In his whale form, Hustle moves through the water. Tiny realizes he cannot pursue him into the ocean, but then he has a vision. His wolf shows him something. The protagonist sees the wolf walking through the air, and had no idea it was capable of doing that. He asks the lunar wolf if this is one of its abilities. Receiving confirmation, Tiny asks if the wolf can use it now if he assists. But upon further thought, he realizes he doesn't know how to do that and thinks there might be another opportunity. He then remembers Hustle saying he would delay his death, and wonders what the enemy is trying to achieve. In a nearby cave, Hustle walks deeper into the location, saying that, as always, it was perfect. Then he encounters the wave mage, whom he keeps imprisoned. Furious, the mage hurls insults at him non-stop. Hustle asks if that's how he treats the person helping him, claiming that, despite appearances, he still cares for him. He also says that if the mage doesn't eat and faints, the monster he's controlling might escape. At the back of the cave, they see a massive sea monster, which the mage keeps under constant watch. This monster doesn't seem at all happy to be confined. It even tries to escape, slamming against the prison holding it. Hustle says it's incredible, calling it a precious miracle his organization acquired. He adds that if the monster escapes, it will send a telepathic message to its mother, and if it's killed, the mother will know immediately. To him, it's only a matter of time before Kurun is destroyed. He then tells the mage that if he wants to save his hometown, he must put more effort into keeping the monster trapped. Angrily, the mage says Hustle will face divine punishment. Hustle merely laughs at this provocation, claiming he already received such punishment at birth, and stating that what's about to happen is just settling old scores. As soon as he leaves the cave, the mage feels a bit relieved. Still, he remains focused on the monster, keeping it trapped within his magical cage, because he says he won't let Hustle's desires become reality. Sometime later, the protagonist returns to the royal palace. Liam accompanies him, and before the king, confirms the report that all the sailors were demonic followers. The king asks about the cargo. Liam replies that it consisted of items used for magical rituals, and that the combined value was equivalent to half the kingdom's annual provisions. This makes the king think he should have suspected Hustle sooner. Hustle had told the king he would show how mutants could contribute to the world. He was a man of great ambition. He also proved to be competent, so the king wonders why he switched sides. Tiny apologizes to His Majesty, but says he heard from Liam that almost no one knew about Lippmann or his duties. The king says that's exactly what Hustle wanted since he was trying to avoid the killings of beastmen. The protagonist states that they should have suspected it, asserting that those with ambition don't hide. Liam doesn't appreciate Tiny's tone, but the king says he's right, and that they of the royal family should have noticed Lippmann's malicious intent. However, he affirms that crying over spilled milk won't change anything. Then he calls Tiny a little hero, and now that they've lost Hustle, he asks if Tiny has a way to track down the demonic followers. The protagonist replies that he does, and asks for the king's help with something specific to carry out his plan. After that, Tiny heads to another location. He knocks on the door of an establishment. Jay answers, saying they're still closed. However, the protagonist introduces himself. Jay doesn't recognize him due to his hood, but nonetheless, he asks what's accompanying him. After some conversation, Jay understands what happened and realizes Tiny encountered a demonic follower who was difficult even for him to identify. Now he understands why things became so complicated, but Tiny says the man didn't have any apparent demonic energy. Hustle is simply working with the demon worshippers. Jay concludes that there really are people who make such choices, and he is truly speechless, as he didn't expect Tiny to approach him so directly. He says he has long wanted to show him the potential of the Black Wings. Tiny asks what would happen if he still had a chance. Jay asks what he's talking about. The protagonist then picks up one of the boxes he brought, and says that His Majesty has ordered him to collect all the remaining artifacts. He adds that if Jay truly belongs to the Black Wings, they must at least have a specialist in tracking magic. He also says that now is the time for the Black Wings to shine. Tiny tells Jay to find a tracking magic specialist to examine all the artifacts so they can get rid of them. Tiny then asks where the tracker mage is and tells Jay to bring them immediately. But Jay says that will be very difficult. Desperate, the protagonist asks why. Jay explains that they've tried before, but the enemies must be very cautious, as they get rid of all evidence. The protagonist thinks he's doomed now and wonders if he went through all those trials for nothing. However, Jay says that's not entirely true. He explains that the shipment of demon worshippers' goods Tiny brought to his establishment is massive. It's not the kind of quantity they'd gather at once without a good reason. Indeed, Jay says that ordering such a large amount can only mean they're preparing for the ceremony. Tiny doesn't quite understand what that means. Jay elaborates that if Corinne is to be burned all at once, they will be very selective about magical items. But with the ingredients, it's different. At least 3 and at most 10 ingredients are required to perform a single ritual. They'll try to acquire ingredients that don't draw attention. And to amass such a large quantity, it will take time. But if there's a shop in Corinne that sells all the ingredients, they will certainly go to that place to save time. Tiny says that's impressive and tells Jay he's not just good at business. A waiter approaches, and Tiny asks what this is. Jay says he arrived at the perfect time, because he wanted him to try it. It's the popular menu item from his restaurant, roasted chicken with vegetables. Tiny thanks him but wants to avoid it. Jay insists that he try it before passing judgment. Cautiously, Tiny picks up a piece. After taking a bite of the chicken, he's shocked at how good it tastes. He wonders how that's possible, as he didn't expect the dish to be this delicious. After finishing everything, Jay asks how it was. Tiny asks Jay why he doesn't work as a real chef. Jay feels proud of the compliment, Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.